All London knew the story of the Viscount who cast off his penniless betrothed in order to marry a girl with £40,000. What nobody had expected was that the discarded girl did not weep. She raised her glass, wished him joy in a single sentence that turned 300 people cold, and walked out into the rain. And what nobody expected at all was that 10 months later, every scrap of paper he owed money on would be held by her. According to private letters preserved in a tin box belonging to the Carew family of Norfolk, dated to the spring of 1825, the night that permanently rearranged London society began with a ball so perfect that it ought to have been suspicious. It was the year England went mad for money. South American mining shares had quadrupled in 6 months. 20 new companies were floated every week, most of which existed only upon a well-printed sheet of paper and the signature of a gentleman who had never seen a mine. In the ballroom at Marchburn House that evening, beneath 2,000 candles, the whole of fashionable London danced upon a foundation nobody had troubled to inspect. Nobody, that is but one. Miss Theodosia Carew stood quietly beside the pillars, in a muslin gown that had been made over 3 times, doing the things she did at every ball she attended. She counted. They said afterwards that she was the poorest girl in the room that night. They were wrong. She was the only person in it who knew precisely what every other person there owed, including the man who was, within the hour, going to climb the great staircase and announce his engagement to somebody else, while she stood watching from the floor. The house outside Norwich had been built for a banker, and it looked it. Square, plain, exceedingly well lit, with nothing on the front of it that had not been paid for outright. Local people had been calling it the Ledger House for 40 years, and the old woman who owned it had never once asked them to stop. In the small room at the back, where the afternoon came in flat and gray off the flint wall, she sat with a tin box on her knees. She was 68. Her hands were spotted and very steady. On the table beside her lay a pair of spectacles she rarely bothered with, and a cup of tea she had allowed to go cold, because her granddaughter had asked her a question, and she had been thinking about how to answer it honestly. "Grandmama," Hetty said again, in the voice girls of 17 use when they suspect they are being managed. "Is it true?" Mrs. Frayne said it at dinner, in front of everyone. "She said you were jilted, in the middle of a ball. That a man announced his engagement
to another woman with you standing in the room."
Mrs. Frayne, the old woman said, has been repeating that story for 46 years and has never once got the year right. "But is it true?" The old woman looked at her granddaughter for a moment. Then she set the tin box on the table and worked the lid off with her thumbs. It came away with the small, dry shriek of metal that has been opened perhaps 4 times in half a century. Hetty leaned forward, expecting letters. Love letters, tied with something. There were 3 things in the box. The first was a slipper. One only, without its fellow, pale silk that had been blue once, split across the sole, the toe of it caked in a mud that had dried to the color and hardness of biscuit and had not been disturbed since. The second was a square of newspaper, gone the brown of weak tea, folded into 8. The third was a ledger, calf-bound, plain, the size of a family Bible, with a brass clasp that had been broken and mended with wire. The old woman lifted out the slipper and set it upright on the table between them, as though it were a piece of evidence, which is exactly what it was. "That is from the 6th of May, 1825, she said. "The mud is off the Knightsbridge Road, between the Turnpike and Brompton, and I walked 3 miles in it. I have never had it cleaned. Your grandfather offered twice." Hetty stared at the ruined shoe. "Then it is true," she said. "He did throw you over." "No." The old woman said it without heat, the way she might have corrected an error in a column of figures. "That is the part everybody gets wrong, and I have long since stopped troubling to correct them, because the wrong version is far more comfortable for everyone concerned. She put one finger on the toe of the slipper. Nobody discarded me, child. Nobody threw me away. That would have required them to think me worthless, and they never did. They sat down in a room with a pen, and they worked out exactly what I was worth to them. They priced me. She sat back, and then she said they got the sum wrong. Friday, the 6th of May, 1825, was the third night of a cold snap that the newspapers were calling unseasonable, and the coal merchants were calling a blessing. And inside Marchbourne House on Cavendish Square, none of it mattered in the least, because 2,000 candles will heat a room whatever the calendar says. Theodosia Caro stood at the north end of the ballroom, beside the second pillar, where the draft from the passage kept the air moving and worked steadily through the room. It was a habit, and she had long since given up apologizing for it, even privately. Other women read a ballroom for its alliances, who had danced twice with whom, whose mother had gone pale, which girl had been taken in to supper by which younger son. Theodosia read it the other way round. She had discovered, at about the age of 19, that a ballroom is a balance sheet that has been persuaded to put on gloves, and that almost nobody in it can help telling you the truth about their money if you simply watch them for an hour. Mr. Hollis Dane, for example, over by the card-room door, was wearing a new coat and had bought his wife a set of amethysts, and was laughing rather too loudly at a joke made by a man he despised. Mr. Dane had gone into Mexican mining shares in November and had bought them for the account, which meant he had never paid for them at all, and had carried the bargain over from settling day to settling day ever since at a cost for 6 months. Mr. Dane's amethysts had been purchased with money he did not yet possess, on the assumption that the shares would be worth more in a fortnight than they were tonight. Lady Sarnesford had come in Colonel Reddish's carriage. Lady Sarnesford had her own carriage, or she had had in February. The Pettifers had brought all 3 daughters. The Pettifers had brought all 3 daughters to everything since Christmas, in the manner of a man clearing stock. Theodosia catalogued them without malice. She had nothing against any of these people. She simply could not stop. Her right hand rested on the cord of her reticule, and the reticule was heavier than a reticule ought to be, and had been all evening. Inside it was her father's ledger. Rupert had asked for it. Not tonight, 8 days ago. In the front room, at Michael's place, Brompton, standing with hat in his hands, and that particular expression of gentle competence he wore whenever he was being helpful. "Bring the Baron's book to the ball," he had said. "Mamma's man of business wishes to close out the last of your father's affairs before the settlements are drawn up. It is only tidiness, Thea. You will not want a lawyer picking through your father's handwriting after we are married." So she had brought it. It sat against her wrist all evening like a small, warm animal, and every time she noticed the weight of it, she felt a little better, because it meant tonight was really happening. Her other hand went up without instruction to the base of her throat. There was nothing there. There had been nothing there for 15 months, and her fingers still went looking about once an evening the way a tongue goes to a missing tooth. The Caro sapphires had gone in February of 1824, 11 days after her father was buried. There had been a great deal of talk at the time about how the Baron's estate would be settled, and almost none of it had come to anything. And in the end, what settled the smallest and most urgent of the debts, the undertaker, the sexton, 3 tradesmen in the village who could not afford to wait, and a stonemason who could, was her mother's perrurer, taken by hackney to a discreet establishment in Cheapside with an unmarked door, and a clerk who did not look up. Rupert had driven her. He had been very kind about it. He had said that it would be indelicate for a gentleman to be seen going into such a place with a lady and that he would wait outside. And he had waited outside for 40 minutes in a February wind. And when she came out with the money in a paper packet, he had taken her hands and told her that he would so spend the rest of his life making certain she never had to do such a thing again. She had believed him entirely. She had also, at the funeral itself, been walked from the church door to the lich gate on his arm, through rain, past 40 people who had known her father since her birth and had discovered that morning that they could not quite meet her eye. Rupert Hale had been the only man in that churchyard who had crossed the wet grass towards her instead of away. 3 times that spring he had offered to take her father's papers in hand. 3 times she had put him off, not from suspicion, but because opening the ledger meant reading her father's handwriting, getting smaller and more careful in the last pages, and she had not been able to do it. "You are counting again," says Mrs. Otley, arriving at her elbow with the air of a woman who has been round the whole room to fetch 2 glasses of negus and considers it a route march. "I am admiring the flowers. You are counting the flowers and estimating what the florist was paid, and whether he has been paid. Prudence Otley had been her governess for 9 years and her landlady for 1, and had earned the right to be unbearable. Drink this. You have been standing in a draught to keep your color down, and it has made you look consumptive instead." Above them, along the gallery that ran the length of the ballroom's east side, a tall man in unremarkable black stood with his hands on the rail, looking down at the dancers with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head. 2 ladies had stopped beneath him, not quite far enough away. "Will not dance, will not play, will not do anything but stand about," one of them was saying. "And they say he reads his own accounts. Sits down of a morning with the books like a tradesman." "Aldermere," said the other with relish. "The ledger duke. 40,000 a year. And he counts it himself." Theodosia said to Mrs. Otley in a perfectly ordinary voice and without turning her head, "He is the only man in this room whose money is where he says it is." "I should think that is worth a little vulgarity." It was not loudly said. But the room had thinned at that end, and sound goes upward. The man at the rail turned his head. He looked at her for rather longer than was polite. 3 seconds, 4, with an attention that was not admiring and not offensive, and not, in Theodosia's considerable experience of being looked at in ballrooms, anything she recognized at all. Then somebody spoke to him and he turned away. "Thea," said Mrs. Otley faintly. "He did not hear me. He is 34, he is a duke, and he has ears." On the side table beside them, among the discarded fans, lay somebody's folded copy of the Morning Chronicle, brought in from the carriage and abandoned. 2 young men were leaning over it. "Has done it again," one of them said. "Our friend Cassandra. 3 columns Tuesday, to say that the mining companies are worth less than the paper. The fellow has been announcing the end of the world since the year 23. Who is he, somebody's uncle? A clergyman, I heard. Or a bankrupt. It is always a bankrupt. Nobody predicts a fall except a man who has already had one." They laughed and moved off. Theodosia drank her negus. She had been at Marchbourne House for 2 hours and 11 minutes. She looked, unhurriedly, along the room, then at the card room, then at the supper-room doors. Rupert was not in any of them. She thought back, and could not place him with certainty since the second set. Something near an hour. "I am going to find him," she said, and set down her glass, and lifted the hem of her made-over gown, and went out through the passage door. The corridors of Marchbourne House ran in a long dogleg behind the staterooms, and were unlit past the second turning, because Lady Marchbourne did not believe in burning candles where guests were not intended to be. Theodosia went along them with the reticule against her hip, and the noise of the ballroom falling away way behind her in stages, first the violins, then the general roar. Then everything but the low animal hum 150 people make through two walls. She was not searching in any anxious way. She was mildly annoyed, and mostly she wanted the thing over with. She wanted to put the ledger into his hands and be told what hour he intended to speak to the room and go back and stand somewhere less dratty. At the end of the passage, the double doors of the orangery stood a hand's breadth apart, and warm air came through the gap, smelling of citrus and wet earth and the particular green smell of a glass house at night. Voices came with it. She was 3 paces from the doors, with her hand already lifting, when she understood that one of the voices was Rupert's, and that he was laughing, and that the other was a woman's, and that the woman was Seraphina Vance. Theodosia stopped. Afterwards, when she was old, she would tell her granddaughter that the whole of the rest of her life was decided in the length of that pause, and that at the time it had felt like nothing at all, like the half-second in which one decides whether to take an umbrella. Cannot seriously mean to go through with it, Miss Vance was saying. Tonight, in front of everyone, you are actually going to stand up and say her name. I am not going to announce myself to anything. Rupert's voice, easy, amused, entirely his own. Good God, Seraphina, do you take me for a lunatic? Your mother says the announcement is arranged. The announcement is arranged. The name is not. There was a small silence, and then Miss Vance laughed, a short, surprised, delighted sound, and the sound of it went into Theodosia like cold water going into a tooth. 40,000, Rupert said. Say it aloud, it improves with saying. 40,000, and your father's interest at the bank, and a house in Portland Place that is not mortgaged to the chimney pots, against which we are to weigh what? 400 a year that no longer exists, a name that half the parish still respects, and a girl who mends her own gloves. You are unkind. I am arithmetical. There is a difference, though I grant it is a fine one at this hour. And she is fond of you. Miss Vance's voice had changed slightly. There was something underneath the amusement, now that Theodosia, standing in the dark with her hand on the door, was too occupied to identify. That is not nothing. She is quite indecently fond of you. Everybody sees it, yes. Were you never fond of her? The pause that followed was perhaps 2 seconds long. No, said Rupert Hale. His voice shook on it. It was a small thing. It was 1 syllable, and the shake in it was slight, and a person less accustomed to listening for what people did not intend to say might have missed it entirely. Theodosia did not miss it, and for one wild instant, something in her chest rose towards it like a hand towards a rope. Then the far door of the orangery opened, and a third voice came in, and everything stopped. You are both audible from the passage, said Lady Marchbourne, and you have been for some minutes. Theodosia heard the two of them move apart. She heard a chair. Mama, sit down. Miss Vance, you may stay. You will be family before the season is out, and there is nothing here you will not have to know eventually. The Countess of Marchbourne had a light, dry, unhurried voice, and she used it the way a good clerk uses a pen. Nothing wasted, nothing raised. Rupert, have you got it? The book. She has it in the ballroom, in her bag. She has been carrying it about all evening like a christening present, poor creature. Then you will get it from her before you speak.
Mama, I hardly think tonight is the minus.
3 years, said Lady Marchbourne. She said it the way a woman reads out a total. 3 years, Rupert. In June of 22, I sent you out to Brompton to make yourself agreeable to a baron's daughter, because a baron whose girl is being courted by a viscount will listen to a viscount's family, and Edmund Carow would not otherwise have granted our agent a quarter of an hour. In October of that year he subscribed £8,000, which was all he had. into the loan of a country that any man with a map might have doubted. And he did it because his daughter's young man's people were in it. And that is the entire reason he did it. And if you have ever wondered what your attentions were worth to this family, that is the figure. Behind the door, Theodosia had not moved. Her hand was still raised. She had stopped feeling the weight of the reticule. October of 1822. 8,000 pounds. Poyais. She had been 19. She remembered the week perfectly, because it was the week her father had come home from the city, so pleased with himself that he had bought her a shawl she did not need, and told her that a man was permitted to be a fool about his own daughter once in his life, and that everything was going to be a great deal easier now. He had lived another 16 months. He had spent most of them writing letters, and the counterpart of the subscription is pasted into the back of that book, Lady Marchbourne was saying, with 3 signatures upon it, one of which I do not intend to see read out in a court or a newspaper for as long as I am alive. The girl has never opened it. She has not the stomach for her father's handwriting. I have relied upon that for 15 months, and I am tired of relying upon it. Get the book, and then say whatever you like to whomever you like, and then it is finished, and we may all be comfortable. Theodosia Caro put her hand flat against the door and pushed it open. The 3 of them turned. The glass house was very warm and very bright. After the passage, there were orange trees in tubs down the center of it, and a lamp on a wrought table, and Seraphina Vance's white gown was the brightest thing in the room. Rupert was on his feet before the door had finished swinging. His face went through several expressions and settled, unfortunately for him, on the one that a man's face makes when he has been caught and is deciding which lie to attempt. Lady Marchbourne did not stand and did not change color. She looked at Theodosia for a moment with what appeared to be mild professional interest, as one might look at a column that had unexpectedly failed to balance. "Miss Caro," she said. Theodosia found that her voice worked, which surprised her, and that it came out level, which surprised her more. There was a roaring somewhere behind her ears, and it seemed to be happening to somebody standing nearby. "Madam," she said, "I have a question, and I would be grateful for a straight answer, because I do not expect to have another opportunity to ask one." Thea Rupert said, "How much?" Lady Marchbourne's eyebrows went up perhaps 1/8 of an inch. "I do not follow. You do." Theodosia's hand was still on the door. "You have been keeping accounts on me for 3 years. You have just read part of them aloud. I am asking for the total. How much was I worth to this house?" There was a silence in the orangery. Somewhere behind them, 3 walls away, the orchestra began a new set, and the floor of the room trembled very faintly with 150 people beginning to move at once. And the Countess of Marchbourne, who was, whatever else might be said of her, a woman who did not lie when the truth was more efficient, tilted her head slightly and gave her the figure. "Your father subscribed 8,000 pounds, she said. "Our commission upon the subscription was 5 in the 100, 400 pounds. Against that, I have carried my son's expenses in the business of courting you, the carriage, the flowers, the gloves, the boxes at the theater, a quantity of gifts I thought excessive at the time, and still do, which, over the 3 years, came to something above 310. She folded her hands in her lap. "So the enterprise has cleared a little under 90 pounds, said Lady Marchbourne, "and I have still not got the book. On the whole, Miss Caro, you have been a poor investment, and I am glad we are closing the account." Theodosia stood in the doorway of the orangery and let the figure settle. 90 pounds. 3 years, 412 letters, a shawl she had not needed, a February afternoon in Cheapside, and the whole architecture of what she had believed her life to be and the enterprise had cleared a little under 90 pounds, and Lady Marchbourne was dissatisfied with the return. "Thank you," Theodosia said. Lady Marchbourne's chin came up half an inch. It was the first thing she had done all evening that was not entirely deliberate. "I have wanted a figure for 15 months, Theodosia went on. "Nobody would give me one. My father's attorney would not. The bank would not, and the 4 gentlemen who came to the house in the spring of last year to look at the furniture would not. You are the only person who has ever done me the courtesy of showing me the arithmetic, and I find I am obliged to you for it." Thea Rupert had come round the table. He had his hand out, palm up, in the manner of a man calming a horse, and his eyes were not on her face. They were on the reticule at her wrist. "Thea, listen to me." "No." He took a step. His hand came out further. "Give me the book, and I will." Theodosia moved backwards through the doorway 1 pace and put her right hand flat over the cord at her wrist, and something happened in her face that made him stop where he was, in the middle of the tiled floor, under the orange trees, with his hand still out. "You will not have the book," she said. Then she turned and walked back up the dark passage, and behind her she heard Lady Marchbourne say, quite calmly, "Now you have made a great deal of work for us both," and she heard Rupert begin to run. He passed her at the corner of the passage. He did not look at her as he went by. He had Seraphina Vance by the wrist, and he was pulling her along at a pace that made her stumble, and his face was white and set in the way of a man doubling a stake he cannot cover. She understood then, with perfect clarity and no feeling whatsoever, what he was going to do. He was going to get there first. Marchbourne House held 300 people that night, and the ballroom held most of them. Theodosia came out of the passage door at the north end at 11 minutes past midnight, and the orchestra was still playing, and then it was not, because Rupert Hale had gone up 8 steps of the great staircase and raised his hand, and a man in his mother's house on his mother's staircase does not have to ask twice. The music stopped in the middle of a bar. A cello went on for half a note by itself and then thought better of it. 300 faces turned upward. "Forgive me," Rupert said. "Forgive me, all of you. I am the worst public speaker in London, and my mother will never let me hear the end of this." Laughter, the way a room laughs when it has been told to. Theodosia did not move from the doorway. She was aware of Mrs. Ottley somewhere on her left, and of the 2 young men who had been laughing at the newspaper, and of a woman near the pillars turning to look for her, and then another. Because the Ton had known about Miss Carrow and Lord Ellesmere for 3 years, and knew exactly where to look when a Hale climbed a staircase. "I have a happiness to announce," Rupert said, "and I am too impatient to wait for the proper forms. And I hope you will all forgive me that as well. Miss Seraphina Vance has this evening done me the very great honor of accepting my hand." There was a sound in the room. It was not a gasp. Theodosia would remember afterwards that it was not remotely as dramatic as that. It was a kind of settling, 100 small intakes and adjustments, and the creak of stays, the sound of 300 people, simultaneously deciding where to put their eyes. And every one of them decided in the same place. The circle of floor around her cleared to a width of about 4 feet. Rupert was looking at her over the heads of the room. She saw him look. She understood the look completely. It was not triumph and it was not shame. It was instruction, the way one signals to a servant, and what it said was, "Lower your head and go." And Theodosia Carrow discovered, standing alone in 4 feet of cleared parquet, in a made-over gown, with her father's ledger against her hip, that she was not going to. She crossed the floor. Nobody had expected her to move towards the staircase, and the crowd came apart in front of her without knowing it had. A footman was standing at the foot of the stairs with a tray of glasses, frozen, and she took one from him and said, "Thank you," in a perfectly ordinary voice. And The fact that she thanked the footman was the detail that half the room would still be repeating at breakfast 3 days later. She went up 3 steps, not further. 3 steps put her above the crowd and well below Rupert, and left the whole of the staircase between them. And she stopped there and turned around and faced the room, because she had decided somewhere in the last 4 seconds that if this was going to be done to her in public, then it was going to be done to her in the light. She raised the glass towards the 8th step. "I wish you joy, Lord Ellesmere," said Theodosia Caro. Her voice was not loud. It did not have to be. The room was so quiet that a chair moved somewhere in the card room and everybody heard it. "And I wish you joy, Miss Vance. Truly, you have chosen a man who knows the value of everything." She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed. May this speculation answer better than his last. Somewhere above and behind her, Lady Marchbourne had come out of the passage door. Theodosia did not turn round to look, and never afterwards regretted anything so much, because Mrs. Ottley, who did turn round, reported that the Countess of Marchbourne had put one hand on the doorframe and had stood there holding it. 300 people were still working out whether they had heard what they thought they had heard. About 40 of them had it already. Nobody laughed. 2 men near the card-room door said something to each other very quietly, and one of them wrote something on his cuff. Theodosia set the untouched glass down on the stair beside her foot. She came down the 3 steps. She gathered the front of her gown, and she made Rupert Hale a curtsy, a full one, slow, correct, to the last degree. The curtsy a woman makes to a man of much higher rank than herself, held a beat too long. Then she turned her back on the staircase and walked the length of the ballroom to the doors. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody touched her. The floor opened in front of her the whole way, and she went out through the double doors into the hall with her chin level and her hands quite steady, and she was 17 paces down the marble before she understood that the noise starting up behind her was not the orchestra. Above the ballroom on the gallery, a tall man in unremarkable black had put down a glass of wine he had not drunk and was already moving towards the stair. The cold came at her the moment she passed under the portico, and with it the rain which had begun at some point in the last hour and was now coming down steady and thin and freezing out of a black May sky. "Miss Caro's carriage," she said to the man at the door. She had a hired chaise, 3 shillings and 6pence there and back, as she had for every ball of the season. The man ought to have nodded and sent a boy running. He did not nod. He looked at the wet gravel. "Beg pardon, miss. It went at 11:30, it went. Her ladyship sent it off, miss. The elder lady that come with you was handed into it, and told you'd be staying the night, and that the family's own carriage would take you home to Brompton tomorrow after breakfast." He was young, and his ears had gone scarlet, and he was speaking to a point about 2 feet to the left of her shoulder. "She were very glad about it, the elder lady. She said to tell you she'd air the room. 11:30. Theodosia stood under the portico with the rain coming in sideways onto her arms and did the arithmetic, because she could not help doing the arithmetic. At 11:30 she had still been in the ballroom, counting Mr. Dane's amethysts. At 11:30 Rupert had been in the orangery with Seraphina Vance and had not yet said the word 40,000 aloud. At 11:30 the announcement had not been made, and no one in that house had any reason to suppose that Miss Caro would be leaving early or alone. Lady Marchbourne had sent the carriage away before anything happened, which meant that in the Countess's version of the evening, the version she had planned and costed and arranged, the ledger came out of the reticule, the announcement was made, and Theodosia Caro was left standing in the hall of Marchbourne House at 1 in the morning, with no carriage and no companion, obliged to go back inside, beg a place in somebody else's in front of 300 people who had just watched her be discarded or else to walk. It was very neatly done. It was, Theodosia thought, the single most professional thing anybody had done to her all night. "Thank you," she said to the footman. "That was not your doing. Don't stand out here on my account. You'll spoil your coat." She went down the steps. Cavendish Square was empty, and the gravel of the sweep was loose and sharp, and she felt the first stone come through the sole of her left slipper before she had gone 40 yards. Dancing slippers are 3 thicknesses of silk and a paper sole. They are made for one evening on a waxed floor, and they are not made for anything else. And by the time she reached the corner of the square, she had stopped noticing it. She turned south and then west and set out for Brompton. It was about 3 miles. The rain got into the muslin at her shoulders first, and then everywhere, and by Park Lane, the gown was hanging on her like a wet sheet, and her teeth had begun to go. She kept to the road. She had no shawl. Her shawl was in a cloakroom at Marchbourne House with a ticket on it, and she was not going back for it. And she would think about that in the morning. She did not think about Rupert. This surprised her in a distant way, and she examined it as she walked. The way she examined everything. She had believed herself in love with the man for 3 years. She had gone without a fire in February to send him a birthday gift he never acknowledged. And walking through Knightsbridge in the rain with her feet cut, what she found in herself where the grief ought to have been was a kind of cold, clear space, swept out, with one thing standing in the middle of it. Her father, not the funeral. A night some months before it, in the autumn, the news from the Mosquito Shore first broke, and every certificate in the country turned overnight into so much printed paper. She had never been able to fix the exact date when she had come downstairs at 2 in the morning because she had heard the fire being made up and had found Edmund Carow, Baron Carow, 61 years old, kneeling on the hearthrug in his dressing gown, feeding scrip into the grate one sheet at a time. They had been beautiful things, the Poyais certificates, when he had first shown them to her a year before, in October of 1822, the way a man shows a portrait of his son. Copperplate and a seal and a little engraving at the top of a harbor crowded with ships. He was burning them now with the same careful hands he had once used to lay them out for her admiration, as though even their destruction owed something to the pride he had once taken in them. He had not looked round when she came in. He had said to the fire, "They did not take it from me because I am a fool, Thea. Any fool can be robbed. They took it from me because I believed a man who had been introduced to me by somebody I liked, and I never asked him one single question I would have asked a stranger. And then, after a while, do not be like me about this. Be rude. Ask." He did not live to see the spring. Theodosia Carow walked west along the Knightsbridge Road in the rain and made herself a promise, and it was not a promise about Rupert Hale, and it was not a promise about revenge. And it was so unromantic that she would never afterwards be able to tell it to anybody without watching their face fall. She promised herself that she would never believe anything again. She would check. She had, of course, been doing it for 18 months already. The first letter had gone to the Morning Chronicle in October of 1823, 3 weeks after the newspapers began printing what had actually been found on the Mosquito Shore by the settlers who had gone out to the Poyais country and had discovered, on landing, that there was no country. 250 had sailed. Something under 50 came home. Her father read every report and would not discuss any of them. She had written the letter at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning, in a rage so complete that she had broken the nib, and she had made it as unlike a woman's letter as she knew how. No adjectives, no appeals. Nothing but the terms of the loan set against the revenues of a territory that did not exist, in 6 paragraphs of arithmetic that anybody could check and nobody had. She had signed it Cassandra because it was the only classical joke she could think of at 4 in the morning, and because a woman's name would have gone straight into the fire. They printed it. They printed the next one, too. By the spring of 1824, there were men in the city who cut Cassandra out and kept the cuttings. And Theodosia Caro, who mended her own gloves and could not open a bank account in her own name, had stood in a ballroom that evening and listened to 2 gentlemen laugh at her over a folded newspaper, and had drunk her negus, and had said nothing at all. She was somewhere past the turnpike, with the lights of the Brompton Road strung out ahead of her in the wet, when she heard the horses. They came up behind her fast, and she moved to the verge to let them by, and they did not go by. There was the long grind of a heavy carriage being pulled up on a wet road, and a good deal of hoof noise, and then a plain traveling chariot came to a stop beside her with steam coming off the 4 horses in the lamplight. It was, she noted, an extremely dull carriage. Dark green, no gilding anywhere, a crest on the door about the size of a playing card. In a city where a man with $3,000 a year would put a coronet the size of a soup plate on his panels, it was the plainest carriage she had ever seen at close quarters, and the horses in front of it were worth more than the house she lodged in. The door opened before the footman was off the step, and a tall man came down into 4 inches of mud without appearing to notice it. He stood in the rain and looked at her. "Miss Caro," said the Duke of Aldermere. "Your Grace, what is in your bag?" Theodosia had been prepared in the last 3 seconds for several things. She had been prepared for pity, which she was going to refuse, and for gallantry, which she was going to refuse more coldly, and for an offer of a lift, which she had already decided to accept, because she had lost the feeling in both feet somewhere before Hyde Park Corner. She had not been prepared for that. "I beg your pardon? Your bag." He did not raise his voice. He simply pitched it under the rain, which is a different thing and much harder. "You have walked 2.5 miles from Cavendish Square in the wet, and your right hand has not left your hip once in the last 100 yards. I watched it not leave your hip for 400 yards. People carry a purse. They do not carry a purse like that. That is how a man carries a writ." The rain went on falling. "It is a ledger," Theodosia said. "Whose, my father's?" "Ah," said the Duke of Aldermere. He said it the way a man says a word when a column has come out. Then he took off his own greatcoat, which was heavy and lined and dry, and held it out at arm's length. And when she did not immediately take it, he said, "It is not chivalry, it is inconvenience. If you take an inflammation of the lung between here and Brompton, I shall be the last man to have seen you alive, and I shall spend a fortnight with the coroner." Theodosia took the coat. The inside of the carriage was warm and smelled of leather and lamp oil. There was a japanned box of papers on the floor and a folding writing slope strapped to the panel. It was the interior of a vehicle in which somebody worked. He rapped twice on the roof, and they moved off, and he poured her brandy from a flask into a horn cup without asking, and she drank it and stopped shaking after about a minute and a half. Aldermere sat opposite, with his legs stretched out and his hands folded, and looked at her, and did not speak until she had finished. "I am going to tell you 3 things," he said, "and then I am going to ask you one question. If the answer is no, I will take you to Brompton, and you will not hear from me again." "Very well. First, I did not follow you out of that house because I felt sorry for you. I do not feel sorry for you. In 11 years of ballrooms, I have never seen anything done as well as what you did on that staircase, and if you had wept, I would have gone home." Theodosia said nothing. Her feet had begun to hurt again, which she understood to be a good sign. Second, he reached beside him and lifted a flat portfolio of stiff board tied with tape and set it on the seat between them. "You will want to open that," she untied it. Inside were newspaper cuttings, perhaps 60 of them, each pasted onto a half sheet, dated in a small hard hand, annotated down the margin in pencil queries, figures, a tick, twice a line of writing that had gone through the paper. They were hers, all of them. October 1823 at the bottom. The one about the Bubble Act that the Chronicle had cut by a third and printed anyway. The one from last November, which had been the best thing she had ever written and had been read, so far as she knew, by nobody at all. The lamp swung. The cuttings shifted in her lap. "Third," said the Duke of Aldermere. In November of 1823, Cassandra published 6 paragraphs on the quality of the security behind the South American loans. My brother had died in the March of that year and left me a bank I did not want and had no idea how to run. And I was in the 3rd month of taking advice from men who had all been giving each other the same advice for 20 years. I read those 6 paragraphs on a Tuesday morning. I did not sleep on Tuesday night. On Wednesday, I began withdrawing Aldermere and Company from 3 commitments, and I finished in February, and I was laughed at in Lombard Street for 9 weeks. He looked out of the window at the rain for a moment. That letter saved this house £90,000. I have spent the 18 months since, and something over 400 guineas trying to find out who wrote it. I have been given the names of 2 members of Parliament, a clergyman in Bristol, and a man who turned out to have been dead since the year 21. He turned back. This evening I stood on a gallery and heard a young woman in a made-over gown say that I was the only man in the room whose money was where he said it was. Cassandra used that construction in March. Not the sentiment, the construction. Then I watched her price a ballroom for an hour without moving her feet. And then I watched her tell 300 people that a speculation had answered badly in front of the woman who had brokered it. The carriage rocked over a rut. Neither of them steadied anything. "So," said the Duke of Aldermere, "here's the question. Ask it." "Aldermere and Company requires a man who can read a balance sheet and tell me the truth about it, and I have not got one, and I am not likely to get one, because the men who can do it are all employed by people they are afraid of. I would engage you tomorrow at $800 a year and a share of the profit." He paused. "The law will not let me. It will not let me put your name on an engagement or on an account or on anything else. I have taken advice on it twice this week, in the abstract, before I knew who you were, and the advice was the same both times." "I am aware of the law," Theodosia said. "I have been aware of the law since I was 19. Then you will understand what I am about to say, and you will understand that I am aware of precisely how it sounds at 1:30 in the morning in a closed carriage. Say it." "There is one arrangement English law permits between a man and a woman that would put you in that room and keep you there," said Aldermere. "I am asking whether you would consider it." The rain went along the roof. Theodosia Caro sat with 60 of her own letters in her lap, in a borrowed coat, 3 miles from a house she had walked out of, and found that she was thinking about her father kneeling at the grate. "Be rude, ask." "No," she said. "He did not move. May I know why?" "Because it is 1:30 in the morning, and I have had one evening's education in what it feels like to be an item in somebody else's accounts." She closed the portfolio and tied the tape carefully and set it on the seat between them. 4 hours ago, I learned that I had been courted for 3 years as a means of obtaining a signature. You are now offering to marry me as a means of obtaining a clerk. I do not doubt that your terms are better. I am quite certain your terms are better. But I have only just got out of one ledger, Your Grace, and I will not walk into another one tonight, because I am cold, and it is raining, and you have flattered me with my own handwriting." There was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds. Then the Duke of Aldermere did something she had not expected at all, which was to look, briefly and unmistakably, pleased. "That is the correct answer," he said. "I beg your pardon? It is the answer I would have given. I would have thought less of you for any other." He reached into his coat, his undercoat. She was wearing the other one, and produced a card, and held it out. "Thursday. Number 14 Lombard Street, any time before 4. Theodosia looked at the card and did not take it. "To what purpose?" "To hear terms, not mine, yours. You will come and tell me what you would require, and I will tell you whether I can meet it, and then you will go away and think about it for as long as you like, and if the answer is still no, then I shall have wasted an afternoon, which I assure you I do regularly, and at greater expense." He kept his hand out. "Come as Cassandra, not as Miss Carroll. Nobody at that house has ever met Miss Carroll, and I see no reason why they should start." The carriage was slowing. Through the streaming glass, Theodosia could see the low white terrace at Michael's place, with one light burning in the second window, which meant that Mrs. Ottley had aired the room, had waited up, and was about to have the worst quarter of an hour of her life. Theodosia took the card. "Thursday," she said. She went up the path with his coat over her shoulders, and her father's ledger still knotted at her wrist, and she left both slippers on the scraper by the door, because they were finished, and because it seemed to her, in some way she was too tired to examine, that they had earned it. Number 14 Lombard Street was a narrow stone front between a wine merchant and a house that dealt in marine insurance, with nothing over the door but a small brass plate that said Aldermere and Co., and beneath it, the year 1761. Theodosia arrived at 11 o'clock on Thursday morning in her plainest gray pelisse, carrying nothing but a reticule with 2 shillings in it and a great deal of resolve. She was shown into a waiting room with a hard bench, a smell of sealing wax, and a clerk of about 60 who looked at her over his spectacles the way a man looks at an invoice he suspects of being wrong. "His Grace is engaged," said the clerk, whose name, she would later learn, was Ezra Finch. "I will wait. He is engaged for some hours. I will wait for some hours." Mr. Finch's expression suggested that he had expected this answer and regretted it. He went away and did not come back, and nobody offered her tea, and the bench was very hard, and Theodosia sat on it for 4 hours with her hands folded and her eyes on the room. The room, it turned out, was worth looking at. There was a board on the wall listing the day's exchange rates, chalked up that morning by a junior clerk who had clearly been in a hurry. She read down the columns twice out of habit before she noticed it. The sterling total for a small parcel of Hamburg bills had been carried forward incorrectly, an error of some £400, the kind of mistake that comes from adding a column of shillings before converting rather than after. She sat with it for 20 minutes, turning it over, and then asked the boy who came through with coal for a scrap of paper, and wrote the correction out in a neat hand, with the working shown beneath it, and folded it, and gave it to him. "For Mr. Finch," she said. "Tell him a Miss Carroll left it." The boy was back inside 3 minutes, and this time it was not Finch who came for her. It was the Duke of Aldermere himself, coatless, ink on 2 fingers of his right hand, looking at the folded paper as though it had bitten him. "You have been sitting on that bench 4 hours, he said. "I have. Nobody told me. I did not ask them to." He looked at her for a moment, the way he had looked at her from the gallery, the same unhurried, cataloguing attention, and then he said, "Come through," and did not apologize, which she thought afterwards was the correct decision, because an apology would have implied that the 4 hours had been a mistake rather than a test, and it had plainly been both. His room at the back was small for a duke's, book-lined, with a single window onto a soot-blackened yard and a desk with 3 separate stacks of paper weighted down with what appeared to be ordinary stones. There was no fire lit, though the morning was cool. "Sit down," he said, and then before she had, "Where did you learn to read a Hamburg exchange?" "I did not learn it anywhere. I worked it out the way one works out anything, by looking at what does not add up." Finch has been correcting that clerk's arithmetic for 11 years and has never once found that error before 11 in the morning. "You found it from a bench, in 4 hours, without being asked." I had nothing else to do. Aldermere sat down on the far side of the desk and regarded her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the look of a man doing a sum in his head and disliking the answer, because the answer was inconvenient and also correct. "I told you in the carriage that the law will not let me put your name to an engagement," he said. "I have spent the week since making certain of it. I was right. A married woman cannot hold property, cannot sign a contract that binds her separately from her husband, cannot sue or be sued, cannot open an account in this bank or any other in her own name. An unmarried woman can do rather more, in theory, but no unmarried woman of your rank and my acquaintance is going to be permitted by her family to sit in a room above a wine merchant's and argue exchange rates with clerks for a living. I am aware. So there is exactly one door in the whole of English law through which you can walk into that room and stay in it, and it is the one I offered you a week ago in the rain. And you refused it, correctly, because I offered it to you as a rescue." He stopped. Theodosia sat very still. "I am not going to offer it to you again," said Aldermere. "I find on reflection that I have no wish to be the man who does the asking twice." The silence went on for perhaps 6 seconds. Outside, a dray went past over the cobbles, and somewhere below them, a bell rang for the changing of a watch. "Then I will ask," said Theodosia. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite surprise, closer to the expression a man wears when a column he has been adding by memory comes out exactly as he expected. "Go on." "I require 4 things," she said. "I have had a week to think about them, and I am not going to pretend I thought of them this morning. I would be disappointed if you had. First, I keep the name Cassandra. I write what I choose, when I choose, and no one, not you, not your bank, not your solicitor, reads a word of it before it is printed. If Aldermere and Company profits from what I write, that is a consequence of the writing being true, and not a condition of it. Granted. Second, before any settlement is signed, you create a separate trust in my name, £5,000, my sole and absolute property under the law of equity, administered by 2 trustees of my choosing, neither of them you. You will have no claim on it, no right of access to it, and no right to be consulted about what I do with it. I would suggest Mrs. Prudence Otley of Michael's Place as one trustee, and I will ask my father's former solicitor to stand as the second." Aldermere had picked up a pen at some point and was turning it slowly between 2 fingers, not writing. "That is unusual," he said. "It is legal." "I did not say it was not legal. I said it was unusual." "Continue." "Third, any sum you advance me beyond that trust for any purpose, at any time, is a loan, at 5%, entered in a ledger with a date and a term, like any other debt this bank carries. I will not be given money. I will be lent it, and I will repay it, and I will know exactly how much I owe at every hour of every day, because that is the only kind of certainty I have any faith in left." "And the fourth?" Theodosia had been looking at the stack of papers on his desks, weighted with the ordinary gray stones, and she looked up now. "I will never be required to lie about my father," she said. "Not to protect this house's name, not to protect yours, not to spare anyone's comfort at a dinner table. If a person asks me what happened to him, I will tell them the truth, whatever it costs either of us to hear it." Aldermere set the pen down. "4 conditions," he said, and not one of them mentions affection, comfort, or any of the usual furniture of these arrangements. "No. Good," he said. "I distrust anyone who negotiates a marriage settlement and remembers to ask for affection. It generally means they have not thought carefully about anything else." He drew a fresh sheet of paper towards him and began, without further preamble, to write. "I accept all four. I will add one of my own, and then we will send for the lawyers and stop wasting the morning. Name it." "If you ever come to think me wrong," said the Duke of Aldermere, not looking up from the paper, "you will say so. Not afterwards in private, where it costs nothing. At the time, in the room. Even if there are other people in it, and even if it embarrasses us both." Theodosia considered this for exactly as long as it deserved. "That is not a difficult condition for me," she said. "No," he agreed. "I did not imagine it would be. It is, however, a very difficult one to keep for a man who has spent 11 years being agreed with by everyone who wanted his money, which is most of London, and I would rather bind myself to it in writing than trust myself to remember it in a temper." He finished writing, turned the paper round, and pushed it across the desk towards her four conditions in her own words, a fifth in his, and a space at the foot of the page for two signatures that the law would not, strictly, recognize as a contract between them, but which both of them understood perfectly well to be one. Theodosia read it through twice. Then she stood and he stood, and there was a small, awkward moment in which it was entirely unclear what ought to happen next. Not a kiss, because neither of them had asked for one, and not a bow, because the document on the desk had made that absurd. She put out her right hand. He looked at it for a moment, the same hand that had not left her hip for 400 yards in the rain, and then he took it, and they shook on it, once firmly, the way two men shake on the settling of an account. "Thursday," said Aldermere, "has gone rather better than I expected." "For both of us, I think," said Theodosia, and let go. The special license came from Dots Commons within the week, procured by a solicitor who asked no questions he was not paid to ask. And on Saturday, the 28th of May, 17 days after the bench in the waiting room, Theodosia Carew was married to Sebastian Thorne, Duke of Aldermere, at St. George's, Hanover Square, before a congregation of perhaps 40 people, most of whom had been told of the wedding only that morning, and had come principally to see whether it was true. There was no wedding breakfast on the scale London might have expected of a duke, and no notice sent to the fashionable papers beyond the bare announcement the law required. Theodosia had asked for neither, and Sebastian, when she raised it, had agreed with a promptness that told her he had been rather hoping she would. Mrs. Ottley cried, briskly, into a handkerchief she had clearly brought for the purpose, and pronounced herself entirely satisfied, and told anyone who would listen that she had always known Miss Carew had good sense, which was not, strictly, the same thing as having predicted any of it. The news reached the rest of London somewhat more slowly, and considerably less happily. It was Mrs. Ottley again who brought home the first full account of how it had been received. She had it from a girl, who had it from a housemaid at Marchbourne House, and delivered it to Theodosia over breakfast at Aldermere House, with the relish of a woman handing over a particularly good hand of cards. "They are calling it a scandal," she reported, "which is absurd, because you are perfectly respectably married, and I told the girl so. What they mean, of course, is that it is inconvenient. Half the mothers in London spent the season telling their daughters that Lord Ellesmere had made a very sound match with Miss Vance, and the other half were telling their daughters that poor Miss Carew's disappointment proved that virtue does not pay. Neither party is now quite sure what to say. They will find something. Oh, certainly. They have already found the ball. 3 different versions of the staircase, all of them worse than what actually happened, which I did not think possible. Mrs. Ottley buttered her toast with great satisfaction. You are, apparently, either a woman of extraordinary composure who behaved with perfect dignity under grievous provocation, or a scheming article who had her eye on the Duke from the first and used poor Lord Ellesmere's engagement as a stage. I have heard both from women who were standing not 4 feet apart. And which do you tell them? I tell them, said Mrs. Ottley, that I was not close enough to hear, which has the double advantage of being untrue and of ending the conversation. The season's last real test came on a Wednesday evening in the second week of June, when a card arrived at Aldermere House by hand, addressed to Her Grace the Duchess of Aldermere, admitting her to the rooms at Almack's that Wednesday and every Wednesday for the remainder of the season. It had been delivered, unusually, by the patroness herself, a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s whom Theodosia had met exactly once, briefly, 3 seasons before, and who had not troubled to remember her name on that occasion. I do not, as a rule, deliver these myself, the patroness said, when Theodosia came down to receive her. But I have found that a voucher sent by messenger is easily misread as a formality, and I did not wish this one to be misread. I am obliged to you, ma'am. You need not be. I have watched a great many young women be humiliated in ballrooms in my time, Your Grace, and most of them cried, or fled, or made a scene that gave the room something to talk about besides the man who had wronged them. I have never before watched one climb 3 steps, raise a glass, and hand the humiliation directly back to the person who had arranged it, in front of 300 witnesses, without raising her voice once. She looked at Theodosia for a moment, with something that was not quite warmth, but was close enough to it to matter. I do not give these vouchers for a title, she said. God knows there are titles enough in London that never see the inside of my rooms, and rightly. I give this one to the woman who stood on the 3rd step. Good evening, Your Grace. She was gone before Theodosia had properly thanked her, down the steps and into a plain carriage that pulled away without ceremony, and Theodosia stood in the hall of her own house, holding a small printed card that represented, in the strange arithmetic of London society, rather more than the £40,000 that had been weighed against her 3 weeks before. The gift from Marchbourne House arrived 4 days after the wedding, a canteen of silver, exceedingly handsome, exceedingly correct, and exceedingly cold, with a card in Lady Marchbourne's own hand expressing the family's very great pleasure at the union. Theodosia had it repacked in its original case within the hour and sent back to Cavendish Square by the same footman who had delivered it, with a single sheet of paper laid on top in place of a note of thanks. It was an invoice. The sum on it was precise to the shilling, the value of a sapphire parure pawned in Cheapside in February of 1824. Calculated at the rate the establishment had actually paid for it, with interest added at 5% from the date of the transaction to the present. At the foot of the page, in the same neat hand that kept every column of Aldermere and Company balanced to the penny, was a single line, payable within 30 days. No payment came within 30 days or after. But 3 weeks later, when Mrs. Ottley next had occasion to call at a house where Lady Marchbourne was also present, she reported that the Countess had gone, for the first time in living memory, entirely silent on the subject of Miss Carrow, and had left the room shortly afterwards, on some pretext of a headache, without waiting for her carriage to be properly announced. It was not much. It was, Theodosia thought when she heard it, exactly the right amount. The woman who had once reduced her to a column of figures worth £90 had just discovered, 4 weeks too late, precisely who she had been dealing with, and had discovered, too, that the girl she had dismissed as a poor investment had kept a ledger of her own the entire time, and had simply been waiting for the right morning to present it. The counting house at number 14 smelled of iron gall, ink, and tallow, and, faintly, of the river. And, by the middle of July, Theodosia had come to know every board in its floor by the particular way it complained underfoot. She was given a table in the corner, away from the window, which she understood within the first week to be a test rather than an insult. Mr. Finch brought her the files. Nobody else wanted old accounts long since closed, correspondence with country agents who had ceased to matter, 3 years of shipping manifests for a trade the bank no longer conducted, and set them down without comment, and went away, and waited, she suspected, for her to complain. She did not complain. She read them. It took her the better part of a month to understand what she was looking at, because Mr. Finch had not, in fact, given her nothing. He had given her, without meaning to, the complete history of every commitment Aldermere and Company had made in the last 3 years that nobody currently at the bank wished to think about, and buried in the middle of it, in a set of loan books from the spring, was a pattern that took her 4 evenings and a great deal of ruined ink to prove to her own satisfaction. The bank had, over the preceding 8 months, advanced money against Mexican mining shares as collateral Anglo-Mexican paper, and a good deal of Real Del Monte besides, at a rate that assumed those shares would hold their present value indefinitely. Nobody had asked what would happen to the collateral if the shares did not. She wrote it up in 2 pages, in the plain, unadorned style she had spent 2 years teaching herself in the Chronicle, and left it on Aldermere's desk on a Tuesday morning without a word. He read it, standing up, in the doorway of the counting room, with Finch present and 3 clerks doing their best not to watch. "Which point do you dispute?" he asked, when he had finished, and it took Theodosia a moment to realize the question was not addressed to her. Finch's face did something complicated. "None of it." "Your Grace," he said, eventually, "the collateral is sound while the shares are sound, and if they are not, then the collateral is worth what a man can get for it in a falling market, which is generally a great deal less than what he lent against it." "Precisely." Aldermere folded the 2 pages once, along the crease Theodosia had already made, and put them in his coat. "We reduced the exposure, quietly, starting this week." It was, as far as anyone in the counting room ever admitted afterwards, the first time in living memory that Mr. Ezra Finch had been asked a direct question by his employer, and had answered it against his own earlier advice, in front of witnesses, without a single word of protest. There was a great deal, that summer, to be nervous about, and not only inside the walls of number 14. Parliament had repealed the old Bubble Act in July, freeing any 6 men with a shilling and a printer to call themselves a company, and London had responded with the enthusiasm of a city that had spent 3 years being told it could not get rich quickly enough. New prospectuses appeared in the papers nearly every week, mines that had not yet been surveyed, canals that existed only as a line drawn on a map, a company formed, so it was rumored, for the sole purpose of importing frogs. Men who had never owned a share in their lives were buying them for the account, on margin, on the strength of a name and a rumor, and selling them a fortnight later at whatever profit the rumor would still support. "They have simply stopped bothering to draw the harbor," Theodosia remarked to Sebastian one evening, setting down a prospectus for a canal company whose surveyed route ran, by her own reckoning, directly through the middle of a hill nobody had troubled to mention. "My father's Poyais certificates at least had the courtesy of an engraving. These do not even pretend. Does that trouble you more or less?" "Less on the whole," she said. "A lie that no longer troubles to dress itself is a good deal easier to catch than one that still remembers its manners." Theodosia read the prospectuses the way other women read novels, and found them a great deal less credible. Rupert Hale and Serafina Vance were married in the second week of July, quietly, at a church in Mayfair that Serafina's father had chosen chiefly. It was generally understood for its proximity to his own house, rather than any attachment to the parish. Nobody who attended described it, afterwards, as a happy occasion. They rode home from the wedding breakfast in a hired carriage, the Marchbourne carriage having been sent ahead with the luggage, for reasons neither of them troubled to question, and for the better part of a mile, neither of them spoke at all. "You are very quiet," Rupert said eventually. "So are you. I had thought there would be something to say." There generally is on one's wedding day. Serafina looked out of the window at the passing shop fronts, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she could not immediately think of anything either, which struck her as a very poor beginning to a marriage that had cost her father £40,000, and herself, as far as she could presently calculate, everything else. "My father has been arranging me for 2 years," she said at last, because it was true, and because she found she did not much care any longer whether it was the sort of thing one said aloud. "You are the third title he has walked me in front of. There was a Marquess's second son in the spring of '23, and a baronet with a coal interest in Durham last autumn, and now you. I have worn the same 3 gowns to be inspected in for 2 years, Lord Ellesmere, and I have grown very tired of being inspected." "I did not know that. You did not ask." Rupert had the grace, at least, to look uncomfortable, which was more than she had expected of him. "Do you wish to be released?" he said after a moment, in a voice that suggested he had not entirely thought through what he would do if she said yes. "It is not too late this morning to say so. I would not, that is. I do not imagine either of us would come out of it entirely without cost, but it can be done." Serafina considered this for longer than was strictly polite. "No," she said finally, "you are ruined and I am ruined, and between the two of us we might as well be ruined together, which at least has the advantage of company. My father has spent every shilling of my mother's settlement on the mines already, Lord Ellesmere, whatever he has told you about my dowry, and I do not think either of us is walking away from this carriage with very much left to walk away with." It was the most honest thing either of them had said to the other in a year, and it was, as it happened, entirely true, though neither of them yet knew how true. Rupert did not answer for a moment. He looked at her properly looked, in a way she could not remember him doing since the earliest weeks of their courtship, when the looking had still felt like something other than an inventory, and then, without any of his usual ease, he reached across the carriage and took her gloved hand in both of his. "Then we had better learn to be honest with each other about the rest of it too," he said, "since we appear to have started this marriage the wrong way round, and honesty seems to be all that is left to build on. That would be a novelty for both of us." "It would." He did not let go of her hand. "I am not a good man, Serafina. I do not think I have been one in some years, if I ever was. But I find I would rather be a poor man who tells you the truth than a ruined one who goes on pretending. And since we are shortly to be both poor and ruined regardless, I do not see what either of us has left to lose by trying it." Serafina looked down at his hands around hers, and said nothing for the length of several streets, and did not, notably, withdraw her hand either, which was as close to an answer as either of them was prepared to give that morning. Sir Aubrey Vance had received a letter from his agent in Mexico 3 weeks before the wedding, which he had read twice, folded carefully, and locked in the bottom drawer of his desk, where it remained unmentioned through the whole of the wedding breakfast and everything that followed. The letter reported that the Real del Monte workings had struck water at a depth the original survey had not anticipated, and that the pumping engines presently on site were wholly inadequate to the task, and that the cost of the engines that would be adequate to be shipped from England at a season when shipping was neither cheap nor certain exceeded the original estimate for the entire mine by a factor of something over 10. Sir Aubrey did not tell his daughter this. He did not tell his new son-in-law this. What he did, in the 3 weeks between reading the letter and the wedding, was begin, very quietly, through 2 brokers who did not know each other existed, to sell. Theodosia opened her father's ledger for the first time on a wet evening in the middle of September, alone, at the small writing table in her sitting room at Aldermere House, 15 months and 1 week after his funeral. She had been putting it off. She understood by then that she had been putting it off since February of the previous year, through every excuse she had ever offered Rupert about a lawyer's convenience, and she understood, too, watching her own hand hesitate over the brass clasp, that there was no longer any excuse available to her at all, because the man who had asked her to bring it to a ballroom had done so precisely because he knew she would not have opened it herself. The early pages were ordinary. Household accounts, a note of the harvest at the small property in Norfolk that had come with her mother's marriage settlement, a list of tenants and their rents going back a decade, all of it in her father's neat, unhurried hand, the hand of a man who had never once in his life expected disaster. The writing changed somewhere past the middle of the book. It grew smaller. The lines drew closer together, as though the paper itself had become dear, and the figures, which had once been rounded off comfortably to the nearest pound, began to run to shillings and then to pence. The arithmetic of a man watching every farthing, because he had begun at last to understand that farthings were all he had left. And near the back, folded once and pasted flat against the final leaf, was the counterpart of a subscription agreement, dated the 14th of October, 1822. Theodosia read it 3 times before she trusted what she was seeing. It set out the terms of an £8,000 loan to the government of a territory on the Mosquito Shore, styled in the document, with a straight face, a Poyasian bond, redeemable at 4% over 20 years, secured the document said. In language her father must once have found reassuring against the future revenues of the said territory. There were 3 signatures at the foot of the page. The first was an agent's on behalf of the House of Hale, witnessing the transaction and taking, she now knew, a commission of 5% for the introduction. The second was her father's, Edmund, Baron Caro, in the same careful hand as the rest of the ledger, not yet grown small. The third was the guarantor's, the name that stood behind the loan, the name whose credit had made an unknown country's promise seem, to a widower with 1 daughter and a shipping fortune already half gone, worth the whole of what remained to him. Marcus Thorne. Theodosia sat with the ledger open on her knees for a long time, listening to the rain on the window, and did not move at all. She found Sebastian at 9:30 in the small dining room where he generally worked through his own correspondence after supper, and she did not knock, and she did not sit down. She set the open ledger on the table in front of him, the counterpart of the subscription facing upward, and stepped back. He read it. She watched his face while he did, because she had promised herself, walking down the stairs, that she would watch every second of it, so that afterwards no one, not even he, would be able to tell her later that his surprise had been anything other than genuine. It was genuine. She was as certain of that watching him as she had ever been certain of anything in her life. The color went out of his face by degrees, the way it goes out of a man's face when a fact he has never once considered arrives fully formed and will not be argued with, And when he looked up at her, his first words were not a defense. "I did not know this," he said. "I believe you. Marcus never told me. I was 23 when he died, Thea. I had no part in the running of anything. I did not so much as see the guarantee book until the solicitors handed it to me a fortnight after the funeral, and I have never in 3 years had occasion to open it again." "I believe you," she said again, "and it changes nothing about what is written on that page." He sent for Finch. It was gone 10 o'clock when the old clerk arrived, in his nightclothes with a coat thrown over them, and it took him one look at the open book on the table to understand precisely why he had been sent for, and his face, unlike Sebastian's, showed no surprise at all. "You knew," Sebastian said. "It was not a question." "I knew," said Finch. "For how long?" "Since the week you inherited, Your Grace. I found the guarantee book before you ever saw it. I did not show it to you." "Why?" Finch stood very straight, the way a man stands when he has rehearsed an answer in his head many times without ever expecting to have to give it. "My daughter was married that spring, Your Grace, to a solicitor's clerk who had made his interest conditional, more or less, upon the good name of the house I served. If the guarantee had come out then, a young duke, 3 months in his title, his late brother's signature on a fraud that had just then begun to be spoken of, in every coffee house in the city, I did not believe the name would have survived it, and I did not believe my daughter's engagement would have survived the name. I made a choice. I have lived with it for 2 years, and I would tell you, if you ask me honestly, that I would very likely make the same choice again, and that I am also very sorry for it." Nobody spoke for a moment. Sebastian stood very still, one hand resting on the back of a chair he had not troubled to sit in again since the ledger had first been opened, and Theodosia watched him work through something that was plainly not anger, or not only anger, but the particular exhaustion of a man discovering that even the people he had trusted longest kept accounts of their own that he had never been permitted to see. "You are dismissed," Sebastian said finally, "from this house as of tonight." Finch bowed once and turned to go, and got as far as the door before Theodosia spoke. "Wait," she said. He stopped. "You will be dismissed," she said, "and you will be engaged again in the morning on one condition, which is that from this day forward you answer to me before you answer to anyone else in this bank, on any matter touching what a client has been told and what a client has not. I do not require you to have been a better man 2 years ago, Mr. Finch. I require you to be a better one now. And I find that a man who is ashamed of a choice is generally a safer one to trust with the next difficult choice than a man who never doubted himself at all." Finch looked at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time in the 4 months she had known him, he bowed to her the way he bowed to Sebastian fully, without the small reserve he had kept for a woman he had once made wait 4 hours on a bench. "Your Grace," he said, and went. When the door had closed, Theodosia closed the ledger and did not open it again that night. "I am going to Reichold in the morning," she said. "Then not from you. I am not leaving you, Sebastian, whatever this looks like. I am leaving the money." She met his eyes across the table, and, to her own surprise, that her voice did not shake at all. "There is no clause in any settlement I signed that obliges me to sleep every night in a house that was paid for, in part, with what was taken from my father. I need to be somewhere that debt is not on the walls while I decide what I think it is owed." He did not argue with her. He asked, instead, in a voice that had gone very quiet, whether she would allow him to have the carriage brought round for her in the morning, and she said that she would, and that was the whole of the conversation, and it was, in its way, the most honest either of them had ever managed to be with the other. Reichold was a small manor in the Weald of Kent, part of the Aldermere estate, but not a place the family had troubled to visit in a generation, And it suited Theodosia's purpose exactly because nobody in London thought to look for a duchess there. She stayed 5 weeks. She did not spend them, as Sebastian had half feared and never said, sitting at a window watching the rain. She spent the first 10 days going through the guarantee book page by page with a clerk's patience, drawing up a list of every name attached to the Poyais subscription. Her family's misfortune had first opened a door to, and then she did the thing that no lawyer, no solicitor, and no banker had thought necessary in 3 years. She went to see them, not all 61. There were 61 names on the list in the end, from a baronet in Hampshire who had lost £11,000 to a curate's widow in Suffolk who had lost 40. And Theodosia did not have 5 weeks enough for 61 visits, however much she might have wished for them. She chose 9 spread across the counties within a day's reach of Reichold, chosen for no reason she could entirely explain, except that she wanted, before she trusted a single figure Sebastian's solicitors intended to put in a newspaper, to sit in 9 separate parlors and hear 9 separate accounts of exactly what had been lost, in the survivor's own words, before she allowed anyone to reduce it to a total. She heard the curate's widow describe selling her piano. She heard a retired naval captain describe the particular shame of explaining to his sons why there would be no university for either of them. She heard twice the same phrase a man introduced to me by somebody I liked, and each time it went into her like a small cold blade, because it was, almost word for word, what her own father had said to the fire. By the end of the 3rd week, she had checked every figure against every account she could obtain, and the 9 did not merely agree with the totals in the guarantee book. They agreed with them to the shilling. The sum, when Sebastian's solicitors finally set it down in full, came to £61,000, the whole of what Marcus Thorne's signature had once promised to make good across 61 ruined subscriptions, hers among them. Sebastian did not wait for her to return before he acted, which she understood, when she heard of it, to be its own kind of answer to the question she had left unspoken at Reichold. In the 3rd week of October, the Times carried, at the bank's own expense, a full accounting of the Poyais guarantee, naming Marcus Thorne, late Duke of Aldermere, as the man whose signature had stood behind it, and naming Aldermere and Company as the house that would, over the course of the coming year, make good the whole of the loss to every subscriber whose name appeared on the schedule, £61,000, to be raised, the notice said plainly, by the sale of 2 family properties in Northumberland. It was, by any measure London recognized, an act of extraordinary and quite unnecessary generosity, and London did not, on the whole, thank him for it. John Bull ran 3 consecutive numbers, suggesting that a duke who confessed his own brother's fraud in a public newspaper was either a saint, a fool, or a man attempting to buy back a reputation his new wife's connections had cost him, and left the question of which rather pointedly to its readers. A book was opened at White's, discreetly, on the probable date of the Duke of Aldermere's ruin, with the odds shortening steadily through November as the 2 Northumberland sales dragged on longer than anyone had hoped. Theodosia read every word of it at Reichold, in newspapers 3 days old by the time they reached her, and understood, reading it, exactly what it had cost him to make the debt public before she had asked him to, and exactly why he had done it anyway. She came home in the last week of October, not because her anger had burned itself out, it had not, quite, and would not for a long time, but because the figures matched, and because a man who publishes his own family's disgrace in the newspaper before his wife returns home is not, whatever else may be true of him, keeping a second set of books. Sebastian met her at the door himself, without a footman, which she noted and did not remark on. The sale of the second estate closes in December, he said, before she had so much as removed her gloves. It will not cover the full $61,000 until the spring, but every subscriber has been written to individually, with a schedule, and Finch is holding the funds already raised in trust rather than in the general account, so that no creditor of this bank can ever touch a shilling of it before it reaches the people it belongs to. I know. I read the notice. Then you know I did not wait for your permission. No, Theodosia agreed. You did not. I find, having thought about it for 5 weeks in a very small house in Kent, that I am glad you did not. Because if you had waited for my permission, I should have spent the whole of that time wondering whether the apology was for my father or for me. And now I need not wonder at all. It was not forgiveness, quite. It was something closer to an accounting reconciled, both columns checked and found, at last to balance. And it was, that evening, in the small dining room where the ledger had first been opened, the occasion of the first kiss either of them had troubled to give the other, since the handshake in the room above the wine merchant's. By November, the season's speculation had begun, in certain quarters of the city, to look less like prosperity and more like a fever that had simply not yet broken. The Bank of England's reserves, which had stood comfortably above 10 million in the spring, had fallen by more than half, bled away in gold sent abroad to settle the accounts of 100 small country banks that had lent recklessly against paper nobody any longer quite trusted. Men who had made fortunes in April were quietly selling in November at whatever price the market would bear, and saying nothing about it to their neighbors who were still buying. Theodosia wrote what would prove to be Cassandra's final letter in the second week of the month, 4 paragraphs, published without her name, as always, warning that a country bank's note was only ever as good as the gold behind it, and that a run begun in one county town could, in a fortnight, become a run in every county town that shared a correspondent bank with the first. Nobody who read it that week believed it would happen quite so quickly. Nobody who read it a month later doubted it again. She had by then a small fortune of her own to manage besides Cassandra's warnings, and managing it taught her, in the space of a single gray afternoon in Change Alley, exactly how much of the city's machinery had never once been built with a woman in mind. She could not sit upon the floor of the exchange. No woman could. It was not forbidden so much as simply unthinkable, the way it is unthinkable for water to run uphill, and nobody troubled to write the rule down because nobody had ever imagined a reason to test it. What she could do and did was engage a jobber, a broker, who worked the bargains for the account on behalf of clients who could not or would not appear upon the floor themselves to place, on her instruction and with her trust fund's money, a series of contracts for the settling days of October, November, and December, wagering, in effect, that the mining shares still climbing so merrily through the autumn papers would be worth a great deal less by Christmas than they were worth in October. The jobber, a stout, unhurried man named Pike, who did a great deal of business for ladies of a certain sort, and none whatsoever, until now, for a duchess, made his opinion of the arrangement clear without ever quite stating it. "Commission's a guinea in the 100 for the gentleman, your grace," he said, the first time she called at his office off Threadneedle Street, veiled and unannounced. "For yourself, given the unusual character of the instruction, and the trouble I'll have squaring it discreetly with the house, I'd have to ask 3. It was, she knew perfectly well, an outrage. And she knew equally well that there was not another jobber within half a mile who would quote her better terms for the privilege of executing a bare position on a woman's instruction without asking questions she had no intention of answering. 3 then, she said, and paid it, and did not haggle, because she had learned by then that the cost of being taken seriously by men who did not wish to take her seriously was simply a line item, like any other. And the only question worth asking about a line item was whether the return justified it. By the second week of December, it had, and Mr. Pike, who had spent 30 years believing himself entirely unshockable, found himself obliged to revise the opinion when the veiled lady's fourth instruction alone returned a profit that exceeded his own annual income twice over. He did not lower his commission. He did, however, begin addressing her correspondence as Madam, rather than the studied blankness he had used at first, which she understood, from a man of his particular trade, to be very nearly an apology. It was in that same fortnight, cold gray, the fog thick enough along the river to swallow a boat whole, that Seraphina Vance, now Lady Ellesmere for 5 months, and finding the title had improved her circumstances rather less than she had once imagined it would, called at Aldermere House on a pretext so thin she was faintly ashamed of it even as she offered it. "I have come to beg the receipt for that cent you wear," she said, seated in Theodosia's small sitting-room with her gloves still on, in the manner of a woman who did not intend to stay long enough to need to remove them. "Orange flower and something I cannot place. My father asks after it constantly." This was, on its face, an unlikely errand for Sir Aubrey Vance, who had shown no previous interest in scent of any description, and Theodosia noted the oddness of it and set it aside, because Seraphina looked thin and tired in a way that had nothing to do with fashion, and it did not seem at that moment the kindest use of the hour to press her on it. They spoke, instead, of nothing in particular, for perhaps 20 minutes, and at some point in the course of that nothing, while Theodosia was called briefly from the room to answer a note from Finch, Seraphina's eye fell on a half-sheet of paper lying on the writing table. A working note in Theodosia's own hand, figures crossed out and rewritten twice in the margin, the ordinary debris of an afternoon's calculation. She picked it up. She had no clear idea, turning it over in her gloved fingers, of what use such a thing could possibly be to anyone, or why her father, who had asked her, with a carelessness that had not struck her as strange until this exact moment, to bring back whatever you can, letters, papers, anything with her hand on it. "He says it's for a wager." Nothing more should want a scrap of a woman's private arithmetic. She told herself it was nothing. She folded it once, small, and put it inside her glove. And when Theodosia returned to the room a minute later, Seraphina had already sent recipe forgotten, murmuring something about the hour and her father expecting her, and was gone from the house before either of them had quite finished the sentence they had been in the middle of. It would be some weeks before Seraphina understood what she had carried out of that room in her glove, or what it would be made to do. By then it would be too late to bring it back. Cordelia Hale, Countess of Marchbourne, learned of the failure of Pole, Thornton and Company on the morning of the 13th of December, the way she learned most things that mattered, from a note delivered before breakfast by a man she paid a good deal of money to know things early. She read it twice, standing by the cold grate in her husband's old study, a room she had not troubled to change since his collapse 4 years before, because a room that looked unaltered discouraged questions about who was, in fact, making the decisions within it. And then she sat down quite calmly and began to think. Pole, Thornton had been one of the great houses of the city, correspondent bank to more than 40 country banks across England, and its failure meant, by the plainest arithmetic Cordelia possessed, that every one of those 40 country banks would themselves be short of London gold within days, and that the panic, once it began, would not confine itself politely to Lombard Street. She had spent 4 years managing what remained of her family's fortune, through a network of agents who did not know one another's names, because a countess whose husband still technically drew breath could not sign a contract, could not hold a bank account, could not so much as open a subscription in her own name without a male relations countersignature, and Cordelia Hale had discovered, in the ashes of that particular indignity, that a woman clever enough could run an entire financial enterprise through other men's signatures for years without a single one of them fully understanding whose hand was actually on the ledger. It was, she reflected, watching the fire die in the grate she had not troubled to relight, rather elegant in its way. The law that had been built to keep her powerless had simply never anticipated that she would learn to be powerful invisibly instead. But the law's blindness would not save Rupert now. Her son had mortgaged Hathermere to the roof beams to buy mining shares in the spring, on her own advice, because the shares had been climbing steadily for a year, and she had believed, as had half of London, that they would go on climbing a while longer yet. He had bought at the top. He would, within days, if the panic ran as she now expected it to, be a man whose entire visible fortune consisted of paper that no one in London would touch. There was one avenue left, and it was ugly, and Cordelia Hale had never in her life allowed a thing's ugliness to stop her from using it when the alternative was ruin. She sent for Sir Aubrey Vance. He came within the hour. Gray-faced, having spent the night, she gathered from the state of his cravat, doing sums of his own that had come out no better than hers. Aldermere and Company holds a great deal of paper. It cannot easily call in before the new year, Cordelia said, without preamble, once the door was closed. If it were believed, even for a single day, that the bank itself could not meet its obligations, there would be a run on it before noon. A run once begun does not stop to ask whether the fear that began it was founded. You are proposing to invent a panic. I am proposing to accelerate one that will happen regardless, and to make certain it happens top of the one house in London whose collapse would suit us both. If Aldermere and Company falls, every debt it presently holds, including whatever paper it may in future hold against your son-in-law's estate, falls with it into the hands of a receiver who will sell at whatever price he can get, to whomever offers first. A receiver in a hurry does not haggle. Sir Aubrey sat down without being asked, which told her a great deal about the state of his own nerves. There is a rumor that would answer, Cordelia went on. The Duke published his brother's guarantee in October, £61,000 pledged against 2 Northumberland sales that have not yet closed. A letter in the right hand saying plainly that the sum has been committed and the estates have not sold, and that the bank cannot therefore meet its obligations. Such a letter, published in the right paper on the wrong morning, would need no lie in it at all. Every fact in it would be true. Only the conclusion would be false. And by the time anyone troubled to check the conclusion, the queue outside number 14 would already be 3 streets long. And whose hand is the right hand? Cordelia had, in fact, been considering this question for the better part of an hour, and she took, from a drawer of her husband's old desk, a single folded scrap of paper, a working note in a woman's hand, figures crossed out and rewritten in the margin, and set it on the table between them. "My daughter-in-law's own," she said. "It came to me by way of your daughter, who does not yet know what she carried, and I do not intend that she should. There is a copyist in Clerkenwell who owes me a favor large enough that he will not ask why I want it matched. Sign the letter Cassandra, and half the city will believe it before they think to ask who Cassandra is." Sir Aubrey looked, for a long moment, at the scrap of paper on the desk, and then more briefly at his own hands. "It will ruin her," he said. "Whoever wrote it. It will ruin her name along with the bank's." "Her name," said Cordelia. was never worth anything to this family, except as a means of obtaining a signature, Sir Aubrey. I should think you, of all men, understand the principle. He paid the copyist that same afternoon. Cordelia never asked him the price, and he never offered it, and it was, in its way, the only mercy either of them extended to the other in the whole of that transaction. The letter appeared in the second edition of a paper that generally printed for readers with more appetite for scandal than scruple, on the morning of the 14th of December, above the single word Cassandra, stating plainly that Aldermere and Company had committed £61,000 it did not presently possess, that the sale of the estates meant to raise it had stalled, and that a house so extended could not, in the writer's considered judgment, be relied upon to meet its obligations through the coming month. Every fact in it was true. That was what made it work. By 9 o'clock, there were perhaps 30 people outside the door of number 14, Lombard Street. By 10, there were closer to 200, a line that bent round into Birchin Lane and showed no sign of thinning, each of them holding a note or a deposit book, and wanting, in the flat, urgent language of a frightened city, their money now in gold, before the doors closed and did not open again. Inside, Ezra Finch had done the arithmetic 3 times and arrived each time at the same unwelcome number. 4 hours, he said, to Sebastian, in the small back room, with the door shut against the noise from the street. Perhaps 5, if we're careful with the small accounts first, and let the large ones wait. After that the specie is gone, your grace, and I do not know what we do then except close the doors. And closing the doors is the one thing that will finish us for certain, panic or no panic. Sebastian's face had gone the particular gray of a man doing sums he does not want to finish. Close them, he said. Now, before the crowd is large enough to break something. We reopen when the estates close in the spring. We pay every claim in full with interest, and we survive it as a house that shut its doors for a season rather than one that failed outright. No, said Theodosia. Both men turned. No, she said again. Open them wide. Every door. I am going down there. She would not take the carriage. Sebastian argued for it, briefly and without conviction, and gave way when she pointed out, quite reasonably, that a duchess arriving in a closed carriage with a crest on the door said one thing to a frightened crowd, and a woman arriving on foot, in a plain gray coat, walking the length of Lombard Street with her chin level, said another thing entirely. And on this particular morning, of all mornings, it was the second thing she needed London to see. She walked from Aldermere House, with Finch a half-step behind her, carrying in a small leather case the only 2 things she judged worth bringing. The crowd outside number 14 had grown to something nearer 300 by the time she reached it, packed close in the cold, breath rising off them in a single cloud, and there was a note in the noise of it, not quite a roar. Closer to the low, continuous grind of a machine running hot that she recognized at once, because she had spent 4 years learning to hear exactly this sound in the ledgers of other men's ruin, and had simply never before stood inside it. She did not go round to a side door. She went straight up the front steps, through the crowd, which parted for her with the same startled uncertainty the ballroom floor had parted for her in May, because nobody standing in that queue had expected to see the house's own mistress walking towards them rather than away. Inside, the counting room was chaos of a controlled, terrible kind, clerks paying out gold as fast as their hands would move, the specie boxes visibly lower than they had been an hour before. Sebastian standing near the strong room door with the expression of a man watching a wound bleed and unable to close it. Theodosia did not go to him. She climbed onto the long oak counter, in front of the tellers, in front of the first 50 faces of the queue now pressing through the open doors. and stood there in her plain gray coat with the leather case in one hand, and waited until enough of the room had noticed her that the noise began, of its own accord, to fall. "The letter in this morning's paper," she said, when there was quiet enough to be heard, "signed Cassandra, is a forgery." A murmur went through the crowd. Disbelief, mostly the particular disbelief of frightened men who do not want to be told their fear is misplaced, because misplaced fear is a harder thing to carry than confirmed disaster. "I know it is a forgery," Theodosia went on, "because I am Cassandra, and I did not write it." The murmur stopped being a murmur. For a moment the room was entirely silent, 300 people, and not one sound among them but the settling of coal in a grate somewhere behind her. "You will want proof, and you are owed it, because a woman making a claim in a banking hall on the worst morning of the year is worth exactly nothing without proof." She reached into the leather case, drew out a slim folder of her own cuttings kept, these 15 months, against precisely no occasion she had ever imagined, and held up the top sheet. "Cassandra has published in this city for 2 years and has never once in 40 letters used the phrase country bank. The house style, my house style, is provincial issuing house. Every reader of the Chronicle who has followed the correspondence will confirm it. The letter in this morning's paper uses country bank twice. Whoever forged my name did not trouble to learn my habits, only my opinions." She set the sheet down. "There are 2 further errors in it that I will not trouble to explain, because they are technical, and because the men standing closest to the front of this queue are precisely the men who would recognize them if I named them, and I have no wish to teach a forger's trick to anyone still deciding whether to believe me." Nobody moved. Theodosia knelt, unhurried, and opened the leather case fully, and drew out 2 things and set them, side by side, on the counter in front of her. The first was a single sheet of parchment, freshly drawn that morning by her own solicitor, and signed an hour before in his office, a deed placing the whole of her separate trust, every shilling of it, principal and the autumn's trading profit, together as first loss capital against any claim made on Aldermere and Company before the year's end. If the bank could not pay, her money would be spent to the last farthing before a single depositor lost a penny of theirs. The second was her father's ledger. "This bank's books are open," she said, "every page to any man in this room who wishes to check them this morning, before you have your money out of the door, if you would rather have certainty instead. I am not asking you to trust me. I have spent my whole life being told that trust is not owed to a woman's word, and I find, on the whole, that I agree trust ought to be earned with figures, not asked for with a face. So here are the figures. Come and find the lie in them, if there is one, and I will make it good myself, out of what is written on that first page, before this bank spends a shilling of anyone else's money doing it." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, near the front of the queue, an old man in a brown greatcoat, a man Theodosia recognized, with a small jolt, as one of the 9 she had sat with at Raysholt, a retired naval captain who had once described to her, in a cold parlor in Sussex, the particular shame of explaining to his sons why there would be no university for either of them, and who had, 3 months before, received the whole of his lost subscription back from this same bank in full, with the newspaper notice to prove it. Took off his hat. He looked at the ledger on the counter. He looked at Theodosia. Then he put his hat back on and turned and walked out through the doors he had come in by, back into the cold. A second man followed him within the minute. Then a third, and a fourth, and the line, which had taken 3 hours to grow to 300, began, in considerably less time than that, to come apart at the far end and dissolve back into the ordinary traffic of Lombard Street, until there was nothing left outside number 14 but wet cobbles, and a queue of perhaps 40 people who had genuine business and no interest whatsoever in a duchess standing on a counter. Theodosia climbed down. She did not speak again. She gathered the folder, the deed, and her father's ledger back into the leather case, and walked out through the same doors she had walked in by, past Sebastian, who said nothing either, because there was nothing left that morning that either of them could have added to it. Outside, the sky had gone the particular flat gray that meant more rain before evening, and somewhere along Cornhill a bell was ringing the half-hour, and the last of the queue was breaking up into the ordinary hurry of men going back to their ordinary business, as though the morning had never happened at all. There was no celebration that evening, or any evening that followed it, because the panic that had nearly taken number 14 did not stop for having failed at one door. 68 country banks closed their doors permanently in the fortnight after the 14th of December, unable to find gold enough to meet their own depositors. And the failures ran through families who had never held a mining share in their lives. Farmers and tradesmen and clergymen's widows whose only offense had been to keep their savings with a bank whose correspondent in London happened to be the wrong house. The Bank of England itself came within days, by every account that reached the city afterwards, of exhausting its own reserve of coin, and was saved, in the end, by a hastily discovered chest of unissued £1 notes found in a storeroom nobody had thought to check, and by a shipment of foreign gold, arranged through the House of Rothschild, that reached London only just in time to be believed in rather than merely hoped for. Mining shares that had traded at 4 times their subscription price in the autumn were, by the new year, worth perhaps 1/10 of that, when they could be sold at all. Sir Aubrey Vance's fortune, built almost entirely on Real del Monte and Anglo-Mexican paper, went with them, and Seraphina's £40,000, most of which had never, in truth, existed anywhere but on paper, her father had shown to Lady Marchbourne 2 years before, went with it. Rupert, who had mortgaged Hathermere to the roof beams that spring to buy more shares while the buying was still fashionable, discovered, in the second week of January, that the estate now owed more than it was worth, and that the mortgage would not wait for the mines to recover, if they ever did. Theodosia's own trading, closed out at the December, settling days before the worst of the collapse, had done rather better. She did not celebrate that either. There is very little pleasure, she found, in having been right about a disaster. Mrs. Ottley called at Aldermere House twice that week, ostensibly to discuss nothing more pressing than the state of the roads, and stayed each time rather longer than the state of the roads could reasonably account for. She had grown in the 18 months since she had ceased to be anyone's governess and become instead a trustee of some consequence, considerably less inclined to disguise her purposes. "You have that look again," she said, on the second visit, settling herself uninvited into the chair nearest the fire. "The one you wore the week after the funeral, when you would not eat properly, and pretended it was the food." "I have eaten perfectly well, Mrs. Ottley." "You have eaten what was put in front of you, which is not the same thing. And I have known you a great deal too long to mistake one for the other." She looked at Theodosia for a long moment, with the particular directness of a woman who had once been paid to correct a child's posture and had never quite lost the habit of correcting rather more than posture. "You are allowed to be tired, Thea. Being right about 68 ruined banks does not exempt a person from being tired by it." It was, Theodosia reflected afterwards, precisely the sort of thing nobody else in her life had yet thought to say to her, and she was grateful for it, in a way she did not fully manage to express until considerably later. She and Sebastian sat late one evening in the small dining room, the fire burning low, neither of them speaking for some time. "You have lost Cassandra," Sebastian said eventually. "Whatever happens now, that is finished." Every clerk in the city stood in that room and watched you climb onto a counter and say the name aloud. Yes. Does it grieve you? Theodosia considered the question honestly, which she had learned by then was the only way worth answering him. Cassandra was never believed for what she was, she said. She was believed despite a voice nobody could place, which was precisely why nobody could dismiss her either. That protection is gone now, and I do not think I will miss it as much as I expected to, because the Duchess of Aldermere has something Cassandra never had, which is a face people have watched refuse to cry, and a name they have watched refuse to lie. I find that trusted rather more, on the whole, than an unsigned letter ever was. He was quiet for a moment. "What is it you want now?" he asked. "You have been turning something over for a week. I have watched you not say it at dinner 3 nights running." Theodosia set down the pen she had been holding without using. "I want Ellesmere's debt," she said. "Every scrap of it, the mortgage on Hathermere, whatever he owes his tailor and his dressmaker's man and his wine merchant, all of it, wherever it can be found and bought. And I do not want you to buy it for me. Why not? Because if you do, the story London tells afterwards will be the story it has always been comfortable, telling a powerful man, settling an account on his wife's behalf, out of love or pride or both, and the wife herself no more than the reason for it. I did not walk 3 miles in the rain to become the reason for somebody else's revenge, Sebastian. I want to be the one holding the paper." He looked at her for a long moment, and then slowly he nodded, and did not offer again. News of the bridge reached London on the last day of January, a great chain suspension across the strait at Menai, the work of old Telford, opened at last after years of building, a span of iron and stone that let a coach cross water that had drowned travelers within living memory. Theodosia read the account aloud to Sebastian over breakfast, from a paper 3 days old, because the news itself had taken that long to reach Lombard Street from Wales. "There is a kind of money," she said when she had finished, "that builds a bridge a man can drive a coach across in a gale, and there is a kind that builds nothing at all, except the promise of a country that was never on any map to begin with. I have spent a year learning to tell the two apart, and I find I still cannot always do it quickly enough." "You did it quickly enough in December," Sebastian said. "In December, I had my own money on the counter. It is a great deal easier to tell true from false, when the cost of guessing wrong is your own." She spent the first 3 weeks of the new year gathering Ellesmere's debt, working through the trust her marriage settlement had built for her rather than through Sebastian's bank, using an attorney's clerk and Mrs. Otley's name on the purchase deeds, so that no creditor selling out of a mortgage in a falling market thought to wonder why a duchess wanted the paper of a ruined viscount's courtesy title. The trust by then had grown considerably beyond its original 5,000. Her December trading, closed out just before the worst of the panic, had returned better than £6,000 after Pike's punishing commission. Her writing and consulting fees, accumulated quietly over 2 years, came to something over 900, and Sebastian, when she asked him for it, directly and formally, across the same small table where every other term of their marriage had first been negotiated, lent her a further 4,000 at the 5% they had agreed upon in May, entered in Aldermere and Company's own books like any other debt, with a date and a term and his own signature beside hers. £16,000 in total standing ready. No creditor in London in that particular January believed a courtesy title viscount's paper worth anything close to its face. She bought Hathermere's mortgage first, at a fraction of what was owed, and then, over the following weeks, the dressmaker's note, the wine merchant's account, 9 months of unpaid rent on the house in Portland Place, and a scattering of smaller debts to tradesmen who had long since given up hope of collecting them, each purchased through the clerk, from men glad enough to have anything at all rather than wait for a bankruptcy court to decide they were owed nothing. By the middle of February, the whole of it lay in a single case in her writing desk, purchased for a little under £4,800 against a face value she had not yet fully totaled, because she found, oddly, that she was not yet ready to see the final figure written down. With the last £400 of what remained, she went alone to the establishment in Cheapside with the unmarked door and asked the clerk, who did not look up, whether a parure pawned in February of 1824 might still, by some chance, be found. It was found. It had never sold. Sapphires of that quality do not move quickly even in a falling market, and the establishment, it transpired, had simply been waiting for someone with the money and the wish to reclaim them. She paid £610 for what her mother's jewels had fetched, 15 months and 1 week before, as the price of a father's funeral, and carried them home herself in a plain paper packet, exactly as they had left in the first place. Lady Marchbourne's counterattack, when it came, arrived by a different road entirely. She could not touch the debt. It was gone from her family's reach before she so much as learned it had changed hands, and she could not repeat the trick of the forged letter, not after Lombard Street, not with every clerk in the city now able to describe from memory exactly what a real letter from Cassandra sounded like. So she turned, in the last week of February, to the two weapons that remained to a woman with no legal standing of her own, but a great deal of practice in using other people's names, the law and scandal. The threat of a libel action arrived first, by way of a solicitor's letter addressed to the Duchess of Aldermere, alleging that certain of Cassandra's published letters had, in substance, defamed the House of Hale, and demanding a public retraction. Theodosia read it once, set it aside, and did not answer it, because she understood, correctly, that it was not intended to be answered. It was intended to be feared. The second weapon landed a week later, in the pages of John Bull, in an item that named no names directly but left no reasonable reader in doubt of who was meant, that a certain newly married duchess had, on the very night of her supposed jilting, spent above an hour alone in a gentleman's closed carriage before her marriage had so much as been arranged, and that the Tun might reflect at its leisure on what precisely such an hour had contained. It was true. That was, as Theodosia had learned in December, always the most dangerous kind of attack, the one built entirely of fact, arranged to imply a conclusion the facts did not actually support. She did not wait for Sebastian to answer it on her behalf, and she did not ask his permission before she acted, which she understood he would neither expect nor want. She wrote to the same paper herself, under her own name, admitting the hour in the carriage plainly, without apology, and without embellishment. A duchess, she wrote, who had walked 3 miles from a house that had just discarded her, offered a lift by a man she had not previously known well, and taken it, because the alternative was a fever caught from wet slippers on a winter road. She then asked, in the same letter, a single question of her own, who precisely had given the order that sent Miss Caro's hired carriage away from Marchbourne House a full 40 minutes before any announcement had been made that evening, and left her without transport in a driving rain. It was not an answer to the accusation. It was a better weapon than an answer, because it did not defend her conduct, it indicted theirs. And every reader who had ever wondered privately what sort of household sent a young woman's carriage away, before humiliating her, found the wondering answered for them, in print, over a name that had signed itself without flinching. She followed it the same week by delivering her father's ledger, the counterpart of the Poyai subscription, the 3 signatures, the whole account, into the hands of the King's Bench Court where the solicitor's libel threat had been lodged as evidence, should the House of Hale wish to pursue the matter further, of exactly what kind of introduction had first brought her father and Marcus Thorne together. Lady Marchbourne's solicitor did not pursue the matter further. Seraphina Vance came to Aldermere House for the second time in the first week of March, and this visit bore no resemblance at all to the first. She did not ask after scent. She sat, still in her gloves, with an expression Theodosia had not seen on her before, not the tired haughtiness of the summer, but something flatter and more deliberate, the look of a woman who has done a sum and arrived at an answer she does not enjoy, but intends to act on, regardless. "I know what I carried out of this room in December," she said, without preamble. "I did not know it at the time. I know it now." "I believed you did not know," Theodosia said. "I have never thought otherwise. That is generous of you, and I have not come here for generosity." Seraphina folded her hands. "My father is ruined and will very likely hang for it in every sense but the literal one, if the right evidence reaches the right court. I am prepared to give evidence against him, the letter I carried, the instruction he gave me, all of it under oath, in exchange for £300 a year for the rest of my life, and passage to Boston, where nobody will know my name or my father's, and I may begin again as whoever I choose to be." Theodosia looked at her for a long moment. "You are not asking me to forgive you," she said. "I have no interest in your forgiveness. I am asking you to buy something you need, at a fair price, from the one person who can supply it." "Then I accept," Theodosia said, "and I will pay you something else besides the 300, though it costs this house nothing extra to give it." She held Seraphina's eyes. "I am paying you exactly what nobody in your life has ever paid you before, Lady Ellesmere. The price of your own word, honestly given, for its own sake." Seraphina's composure held for almost the whole of the silence that followed. Almost. She stood rather quickly and went to the window, and stood with her back to the room for a moment longer than the view of Green Park strictly required. "I do not know what I will be in Boston," she said to the glass rather than to Theodosia. "I have spent my whole life being arranged by other people into whatever shape they required. I find I have no notion at all of what shape I would choose for myself, given the choosing." "Nor did I a year ago," Theodosia said. "I do not think it is a thing one is required to know in advance. I think it is simply a thing one finds out, slowly, by making enough decisions that are entirely one's own, and seeing which of them one is willing to make again." Seraphina turned back from the window, and for the first time since she had entered the room, something in her face eased that had nothing to do with the bargain they had just struck. "That is either the kindest thing anyone has said to me in 2 years," she said, "or the most useless piece of advice I have ever been given. I confess I cannot presently tell which." "Very possibly both," said Theodosia. "I have found the two are not so often opposed as people like to pretend. Rupert Hale was arrested for debt on a wet Tuesday in the middle of March, in the street outside his own tailor's, by 2 men who had clearly done this before and took no particular pleasure in it, and was taken, without ceremony, to a sponging house on Cursitor Street to wait out the customary days in which a debtor might either find the money or be moved on to somewhere considerably less comfortable. It was, in the strict sense, entirely legal. His father held the earldom still, breathing but silent these 5 years in a darkened room at Hathermere, and a courtesy title carried with it none of the privileges of the substance behind it, no immunity from arrest, no protection a real peerage would have offered, nothing at all but the empty shape of a rank he had never actually possessed. He had known this, technically for years. He had simply never expected to need to know it. The room they gave him was small and smelled of other men's despair, and he sat in it for 2 days, doing very little but watch the light change on the one narrow window, and on the evening of the second day he asked for paper and ink, and wrote a letter he did not send to a solicitor, or to his mother, or to anyone who might conceivably help him. He wrote it to Theodosia. He did not ask for money in it. He had considered asking in the first draft, and had torn it up because he understood, even now, even here, that money was the one thing she would never again give him on any terms he could offer that she would find acceptable. What he wrote instead was this: "I walked you from the church door to the lich gate the day we buried your father. I have thought about that walk more than any other quarter of an hour in my life, and I could not tell you, until very recently, why. I believe I understand it now. For the length of that walk, in the rain, with 40 people watching, and none of them quite able to meet your eye, I forgot entirely that I was doing what my mother had asked of me. I was simply walking beside you because you were in pain, and I did not want you to be alone in it. It lasted perhaps 20 minutes. It is the only 20 minutes of my life I can look back on and say, honestly, that I was not calculating anything at all. I sold it, along with everything else, without ever quite noticing I had done it, and I do not know how a man goes about asking forgiveness for a theft he did not realize he was committing until the goods were long gone. He read it over twice, sealed it, and sent it by the turnkey, who took a shilling for the errand and did not ask what it contained. Theodosia received it on the third day, at breakfast, and read it once, in silence, and then a second time, more slowly. She did not weep over it, and she did not answer it. She folded it along its original crease, wrote across the outer face, in the same neat hand that kept every column of Aldermere and Company balanced to the penny, received the 14th of March. No reply, and filed it, without further comment, in the same case that held Rupert's mortgage on Hathermere and the whole schedule of what he owed her. It was Sebastian who found her, 3 nights later, still awake past 1 in the morning, with the desk lamp burning low and a column of figures in front of her that she had checked, by his count, 4 separate times without ever once writing anything different. He did not ask what troubled her. He had learned by then that asking rarely got him anywhere useful with her, and that showing generally did. He went to his own study and returned with a ledger of his own, Aldermere and Company's full private accounts, the ones no client ever saw, every commitment and every risk the bank presently carried, laid open on the desk in front of her. "Check them," he said. Theodosia looked up. "I am not troubled by your books, Sebastian." "I know. That is rather the point." He sat down across from her in the same chair he had occupied the night the ledger first opened between them. "You have spent a year learning that every man who ever told you he loved you also had his hand somewhere in your accounts. I cannot undo that with a sentence, and I have stopped trying to. But I can show you mine tonight, and every night after this one if you require it, until you stop expecting to find something in them that isn't there." She looked at the open books for a long moment, and then slowly she began, out of long habit, to read. She found nothing wrong. She had not in truth expected to. But she stayed at the desk with him past 3, working through both sets of figures together, hers and his, side by side, and it was, in its unromantic way, the truest thing either of them had yet done for the other. The ball at Aldermere House, the first the new Duke and Duchess had given since their marriage, was held on a bright, cold evening in the 3rd week of March, and every soul in London who had once turned away from Theodosia Carew on a staircase in May made very certain this time of an invitation. She wore the sapphires. She had thought carefully about whether to wear them at all, that evening, and had decided in the end that a woman who has bought back her own history at full price has earned the right to display it, and had gone down to the ballroom with her mother's parure at her throat and her chin at exactly the angle it had held on a different staircase 10 months before. Rupert Hale, released 2 days earlier when his mother had emptied what remained of her own private funds to satisfy the sponging house creditor and buy him a fortnight's grace, was not on the guest list. He came anyway, through the servants' entrance, having bribed a footman with the last coin he owned, driven by an urgency that had stopped being pride some weeks before and had become simply terror. He found Sebastian near the foot of the great staircase and went down on one knee before him, in front of perhaps 40 guests who fell instantly, greedily silent. "Your Grace," he said, "I am begging you to release the notes you hold on Hathermere. My father is dying. My mother has nothing left to give. If you press the claim now, I will lose the house within the month, and I do not know what becomes of any of us after that." Sebastian looked down at him without expression. "You are kneeling to the wrong person, Ellesmere," he said. "I do not hold a scrap of your paper. I never did." Rupert's face, already gray with 2 days' poor sleep, went several degrees paler. Theodosia came down the staircase. She descended 7 steps, unhurried in the sapphires and the deep blue silk she had chosen, precisely because it made no apology for itself, and stopped a little above the kneeling man, and opened the small leather case she had carried down with her, and began in the same flat, patient, arithmetical voice she had used on a counter in Lombard Street 3 months before, to read. "Mortgage upon the Hathermere estate. Principal £7,200. Note to Weston's dressmaker, unpaid 11 months. Account with a wine merchant in St. James's Street, unpaid since the autumn. 9 months' rent upon the house in Portland Place. A schedule of smaller debts to 4 tradesmen, none of them paid since before Christmas." She looked up, briefly, at the sea of frozen faces around the staircase, and then back down at the paper. "The total, Lord Ellesmere, comes to £19,420, 11 shillings. The creditor of record on every instrument is a separate trust established under my marriage settlement, of which I am the sole beneficiary. My husband has no claim upon a shilling of it. He never has." The room had gone entirely silent. Somewhere behind her, Theodosia was aware of Rupert's mother arriving at the edge of the crowd, having heard, evidently, that her son had gone somewhere he ought not to have, and arriving too late to stop whatever was already happening. "Do you know what I paid for it?" Theodosia asked him. Rupert did not answer. His eyes had gone to her throat to the sapphires, catching the candlelight, and something moved across his face that had nothing to do with fear of ruin. Something older and worse, a recognition she watched land on him like a physical blow. He had driven her to that shop himself. He had waited outside it, in a February wind, for 40 minutes, and told her afterwards that he would spend the rest of his life making certain she never had to do such a thing again. £4,780, Theodosia said. "The whole of what you owe, Lord Ellesmere, was sold to me for less than a quarter of its worth, by men who had already decided your word was not good for the rest. You were sold cheap, cheaper, as it happens, than your mother once priced me, and I have had a year to consider whether that fact ought to please me, and I find, on the whole, that it only makes me tired." She drew 2 further papers from the case and held them both out, side by side, so that the whole room might see there were 2, and only 2, and that a choice was being offered rather than a sentence pronounced. "This first is a committal order," she said, "already signed, already witnessed, requiring only my seal to send you back to Cursitor Street, and from there, when the fortnight's grace expires, somewhere considerably worse." This second is a sworn statement, prepared by my solicitor, naming your mother and Sir Aubrey Vance as the authors of a forged letter that nearly brought down this bank in December, and naming the sale of a fraudulent guarantee to my own father as the origin of the debt your family has spent 3 years pretending never existed. Sign the second under your own hand, and I will burn the first and every note in this case tonight in that grate, and you will owe me nothing more as long as either of us lives." Rupert looked from one paper to the other. He looked once up the length of the room to where his mother stood at the edge of the crowd, very still, her face giving away nothing at all. "Mama," he said, and it came out smaller than he had meant it to. Lady Marchbourne did not move for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the silent room, level and precise, the voice of a woman reading out a final total she had known, on some level, was coming for weeks. "Sign it, Rupert," she said. "I taught you what a man does when it is time to sell. There is nothing left in this room worth keeping that you have not already lost." He signed. His hand shook badly enough that the signature came out smaller than his usual careless scrawl, cramped and uncertain. Nothing at all like the confident hand that had once signed 100 letters promising Theodosia a lifetime of safekeeping. But it was legible, and it was witnessed within the minute by 2 guests too startled to refuse, and it was done. Theodosia took the paper, folded it once, and handed the committal order, unsealed and unsent, to a footman with instructions to see it burned before the hour was out. She looked down at Rupert Hale, still kneeling on the marble, a ruined man in a borrowed coat, and found, searching herself for it, that there was no triumph left in her at all, only a great, quiet stillness. The particular stillness of a column that has finally, after a very long reckoning, come out even. 3 years ago, she said, you priced me, and your mother wrote the sum into her own book. Today I have returned the book. We are even, Lord Ellesmere. I find I have no further business with you. She turned and climbed the 7 steps back to where Sebastian waited at the top and did not look behind her again. And the orchestra, after a long and uncertain pause, began very quietly to play. The statement Rupert Hale signed in the ballroom at Aldermere House found its way, within the week, to a King's Bench solicitor, already primed by Theodosia's earlier submission of the Poyet's ledger, and from there into a civil suit that unfolded through the spring of 1826 with a thoroughness that surprised nobody who had ever watched Theodosia check a column of figures twice before she trusted it. Lady Marchbourne was not sent to prison. It was in the end the very law that had spent 4 years denying her a signature of her own that closed around her most completely. A court examining the forged Cassandra letter and the whole architecture of the Poyet's commission discovered, in the course of establishing who precisely had authorized what, that every contract Cordelia Hale had entered on the family's behalf for the better part of 2 decades had been signed by a woman with no legal capacity whatsoever to sign anything, her husband the Earl having been alive, if silent, throughout the whole of it. Contract after contract came before the court voidable, not for fraud, but for a simpler and in some ways more devastating reason. The hand that had signed them had never, under English law, possessed the authority to sign anything at all. She was not imprisoned. She was simply, over the course of a single unhappy season, erased from every subscription list, every patroness's book, every dinner table that mattered, not by any single decree but by the accumulated, unspoken agreement of 100 households, that a woman whose every transaction for 20 years might now be challenged in court was no longer a safe woman to know. She removed to Bath by midsummer, took rooms considerably smaller than any she had occupied since her own girlhood, and wrote, over the following year, a number of careful letters to the patronesses who had once counted her among their own. None of them was ever answered. She kept writing them anyway, once a quarter, for the better part of 2 years to the patroness who had once handed Theodosia a voucher on her own doorstep, to 3 others besides, to a bishop's wife who had dined at Marchbourne House 100 times and had once called Cordelia the cleverest woman in England. She wrote each letter in the same clear, unhurried hand she had once used to read out a figure of £90 in an orangery, and she sealed each one herself, because she had by then no servant left who did not also serve 3 other households and gossip freely between them. A woman in the lodging house where she took her rooms reported, years afterward, that the Countess of Marchbourne had gone on ordering her notepaper from the same stationer in Bond Street, long after she had stopped being able to afford the London prices, because a woman who has spent 40 years keeping other people's accounts in order does not easily learn to let her own habits go slack, even when there is no longer anyone left to see them kept. Sir Aubrey Vance did not survive to see the worst of it. He was named alongside Lady Marchbourne in the civil action over the forged letter, and separately and more gravely in a suit brought by a syndicate of smaller investors who alleged that he had continued selling Real del Monte and Anglo-Mexican shares through the autumn of 1825. While in possession of private intelligence, the letter from his own agent, locked in a desk drawer since June, that the mine could not be worked at any profit for years to come. He collapsed in the waiting room of the very court convened to hear the matter on a warm morning in June of 1826, and was dead before a physician could be summoned, leaving behind him a fortune that proved, upon examination, to consist of considerably less than nothing at all. Seraphina Vance, now Lady Ellesmere in name only, since there proved to be very little of the Ellesmere estate left worth the name, gave her sworn evidence exactly as she had promised, in a flat, steady voice that never once wavered under cross-examination, and sailed for Boston in the autumn of 1826, with £300 a year settled upon her from a trust she had never expected to see, and a single trunk, and no family in London remaining who troubled to see her off. She stood at the rail as the coastline fell away, and found, turning it over as the last gray smudge of England sank below the horizon, that for the first time in her adult life, she could not think of a single person anywhere in the world, presently engaged in calculating what she was worth. It was, she discovered, a very strange sensation, and after a while she decided she rather liked it. Rupert Hale did not go to prison either, once the debt was cancelled, but he went, in every sense that mattered to a man who had once expected to inherit an earldom, to a considerably lower place than the one he had been born to. His father, the Earl, lingered on at Hathermere, the estate itself sold within the year, to satisfy what debts Theodosia's cancellation had not covered, silent and unchanging in his darkened room, outliving the ruin of everything he had once possessed by some years yet, though he never spoke of it, or of anything again. Rupert took a clerk's position at a third-rate brokerage off Change Alley at £80 a year, keeping the books of men who had once been glad enough to dine at his mother's table and now addressed him, without particular unkindness, but without particular ceremony either, simply as Hale. The hand that had once signed 100 letters of empty devotion, and one letter, at the very end, that had contained the only honest 20 minutes of his life, spent its days now copying columns of other men's figures into other men's ledgers, and grew, over the years, rather good at it. Mr. Ezra Finch remained at number 14 for 11 years more, until his own retirement in 1837, and never again kept back a fact from either of the two people he answered to. His daughter's marriage, which he had once been so afraid of losing, survived quite comfortably, without the protection he had thought it required, and he told Theodosia once, near the end of his service, that he considered this the single most useful lesson his long career had taught him, that the things men lied to protect were very often sturdier than the lie itself gave them credit for. Aldermere and Company survived the year that had so nearly finished it, and did rather more than survive. When Parliament passed the Bank Charter Act in the spring of 1826, permitting joint stock banking for the first time outside a 65-mile radius of London, Sebastian and Theodosia together established a new house, chartered, capitalized, and answerable to its shareholders in a manner no private bank in Lombard Street could yet be, with its offices in Norwich, in the county of Norfolk, close enough to the London house to draw on its credit and its correspondence, and far enough from it to fall entirely within the new law's reach. The prospectus, when it was printed, listed the Duchess of Aldermere by name among the bank's founding advisors, not as an ornament to the document, but with a paragraph of her own describing, in the plain, unadorned style, 2 years of a hidden byline had taught her exactly what the bank would and would not do with a depositor's money, and exactly what recourse existed if it ever failed to keep that promise. It was the first time in the history of English banking that a woman's name had appeared on such a document in her own right, under her own signature, answerable for her own words. Nobody troubled to remark upon it as anything unusual. By the time the prospectus was printed, in the summer of 1826, there was nobody left in London who had followed the story of the previous year and did not already know precisely what Theodosia Thorne, Duchess of Aldermere, was capable of putting her name to. They traveled up to Norwich together for the laying of the new bank's first stone, a plain square building on a street of prosperous shop fronts, and within the year had taken a house of their own not half a mile from it, the same square, well-lit house, built originally for a city banker who had never lived to occupy it, that local people would in time come to call, without any prompting from either owner, the Ledger House. Sebastian gave a short speech at the ceremony, correct and unremarkable in every particular. Theodosia gave none at all, having declined, and stood instead a little apart from the crowd with her hand resting, out of long habit, on the cord of a very ordinary reticule, watching the mortar go on and the first course of bricks set true. "You are counting again," Sebastian said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I am always counting," said Theodosia. "I have simply found, these 2 years, a great many more things worth the trouble of counting correctly." They did not return to London to live. Aldermere House stood ready whenever Parliament or business required it. But the house in Norwich became, within a few years, the one both of them thought of, without quite deciding to, as home near enough to the new bank that Theodosia could walk to it most mornings, far enough from Cavendish Square that neither of them ever again had cause to hear the particular note a ballroom makes when 300 people decide, all at once, where to put their eyes. The rain had cleared over Norwich sometime in the last hour, and the light through the small back window had gone from flat gray to the pale gold of a September evening, drawing toward its close. Hetty had not moved from her chair in a long while. "And that is all of it?" she asked at last. "That is the whole story?" "That is the whole of the part that fits in a tin box," the old woman said. "There is a great deal more, of course. There always is. But the box only holds 3 things, and I have shown you all 3. She reached for the ledger one final time and turned, unhurried, past the last of her father's careful, ruined hand, past the Poyais counterpart, She had not touched again in nearly 50 years to the final leaf of the book, where a different hand entirely larger, less careful, a man's hand rather than an accountant's had written a single line dated the 28th of May, 1825. Hetty leaned close to read it. Borrowed, one handshake. Repaid a lifetime. Account still open. He wrote that on our wedding day, the old woman said, while I was upstairs being dressed, and never told me it was there. I found it myself, some years later, going through the book for another reason entirely, and I have never once asked him why he chose that page instead of a letter or a poem, or any of the ordinary things a man writes to a bride. Why do you think he chose it? Because he understood, before I fully did myself, that I would never entirely trust a sentiment I could not check against something written down. He gave me a debt instead of a declaration, child, because he knew I would believe a debt. She closed the ledger, gently, and set it back into the tin box beside the ruined slipper and the brown square of newsprint, and worked the lid back into place with the same small, dry shriek of metal it had made when she opened it. It has never once in 46 years come anywhere close to being settled. I have stopped expecting it to be. Some accounts, I find, are meant to stay open. Hetty was quiet for a moment, turning something else over. What became of the sapphires? She asked. You wear the garnets tonight. I have never once seen you in blue stones. They are in the vault at the bank, where they have sat for 40 years. Because I found, once the whole business was finally settled, that I did not much want to wear them again. The old woman folded her hands upon the closed lid. They had cost too much twice over, by then once to lose and once to buy back, and I decided a woman is permitted to keep a thing for what it proves without needing to wear it for what it shows. Your mother may have them when she is a little older, if she wants them. I rather think she will not. There was a step in the passage outside, unhurried, familiar, and a moment later the door opened and a tall old man came in, silver-haired now, and somewhat stooped, but with the same unhurried, cataloging way of entering a room that had once made two young ladies at a ballroom rail lower their voices without quite knowing why. I heard the story had reached the sapphires, said Sebastian Thorn, Duke of Aldermere, which generally means it is nearly finished. It is finished, said his wife. Hetty has heard the whole of it now, from the staircase to the counter to the ballroom floor, and has asked every question worth asking except one, which I suspect she has been too polite to put to you directly. And what is that? Whether you have ever regretted asking a woman to check your books before you asked her to marry you. Sebastian considered this with the particular gravity he still brought to any question involving figures, however lightly it was put. Once, he said, for about 4 seconds in a wine merchant's doorway on a wet night in May, before she told me it was the correct answer, and I understood I had married the one woman in England who would never let a debt of mine go unexamined for the rest of my life. He crossed the small room and laid one hand, briefly, on the closed tin box, the way a man touches a ledger he has long since stopped needing to open because he already knows every figure it contains. I have not regretted it since. Not once in 46 years, and I find I am not a man given to saying that lightly about anything. Hetty looked from one of them to the other and said nothing at all, which her grandmother thought, privately, was the most sensible response she had given all evening. Hetty sat with that for a while, turning it over the way her grandmother had once turned over a ballroom full of strangers, cataloging what she could and could not yet understand. You keep saying nobody threw you away, she said finally. But everyone at dinner still tells it as though someone did. They will go on telling it that way, the old woman said, because it is a more comfortable story than the true one. A girl discarded and rescued and made a Duchess that is a story with a villain and a hero and a happy ending, and it asks nothing further of anyone who repeats it. The true story has no villain in it who is not also somewhere a frightened person doing arithmetic badly under pressure, and it has no hero either. Only a woman who decided, on one very wet night, that she would rather check the figures herself than be told what they added up to by somebody who had already decided the answer suited him. She set the tin box on the shelf where it had rested for 4 decades and turned to face her granddaughter properly in the last of the September light. "So you have asked me the wrong question all evening, Hetty, and I have let you, because it is the question everyone asks, and I have had 46 years to grow patient with it. You must not ask who threw me away. Nobody did. You must ask instead, who was willing, who has ever, in your own life, been willing to let you check the sums yourself and to abide by whatever you found there, even when the answer cost him something. And if I find no one like that, then you keep your own book," said the old woman, "exactly as I did, until someone arrives who is willing to let you see his." Outside, the evening bell of the cathedral began, faint and steady, to ring across the wet rooftops of Norwich, counting out the hour the way it had counted out every hour of the 46 years since a tin box had first been closed upon a ruined slipper, a brown square of newsprint, and a ledger that had never, not once, been permitted to lie.